Chapter 54. After distributing all the points, Soren began to clean up the battlefield. There wasn't anything good on the kobolds, so Soren began to look for boxes. These creatures liked to hide the good things they collected, and most of them were hidden near their gathering place. Since they were only about 1 meter tall, kobolds usually didn't carry any loot with them. First, he rummaged through the kobold sorcerer's corpse and found some random items. Unfortunately, they were all trash. Soren then began to observe the surroundings, and soon found a stone that was a little different. The ground nearby had been dug up. He pulled out his curved sword and began to dig. He directly lifted the stone and found a wooden box buried below. It looked very simple, but when he took it out, it was heavy. He opened it with the hilt of his sword and looked inside. It was full of gold sand. He didn't expect these kobolds to be so rich. Gold sand was an unrefined gold ore. It was actually gold with very low purity. It could be exchanged for kindler in the temple of the goddess of wealth. Most of the priests of the goddess of wealth took this job, and it was generally fair. Soren reached his hand into the gold sand and felt around. He found a piece of agate, a small piece of obsidian, 3 pieces of opaline, and 1 or 2 stones that he couldn't identify. Kobolds had a talent for mining, and they also liked to live in caves. Even in the wilderness, they could occasionally find some good things in the caves. If they defeated a creature, the nature of the low-level dragon bloodline made the kobolds automatically collect the shiny objects. Not bad. Soren carefully poured the gold sand into the multidimensional bag, and then put the stones inside. He muttered to himself, "Looks like it's worth about 100 kindler." 20 kindler weighed 1 pound, and the gold sand just now should be worth about 60 or 70 pieces. There were more ores in this world, and these stones were worth about 30 kindler. However, if he wanted to sell them, he would have to find a jewelry merchant, and the price might be lowered. Normal kobold tribes wouldn't have accumulated so much loot, but it was probably because of the kobold wizard. Wherever there was a wizard, the loot would always be higher. If they killed the spellcasters, stripping them naked was a very normal thing. The kobold sorcerer was only around level 2. It didn't have anything good on it except for the ebony staff +1. This was the least valuable rare grade equipment. It was made of a special kind of wood that was relatively sturdy. It was like ironwood and didn't have any additional effects. However, it was very hard and could be used to block weapons. It was about 10 kindlers worth. It was about the same price as Soren's scimitar, but not many people were willing to buy it. The low-grade droll would like to carry it with them because it would not affect their spellcasting. It could also be used as a spellcasting material at critical moments because it was made of wood. Soren took the valuable items and quickly left. The smell of blood was very likely to attract nearby beasts, including wolves, ogres, gnolls, and other creatures. If he stayed here, he might run into them. He had suffered a lot in the past. He was almost turned into dumplings by the gnolls who were attracted by the smell of blood. It was very difficult to keep these corpses for more than 2 days. Other creatures would probably be attracted by night. If he was strong enough, he could wait for them to come. Unfortunately, Soren was still injured. It would be fine if the wolves were attracted, but if the gnolls were attracted, he would be screwed. Gnolls had a monster level of 3. If they had an advanced profession, their monster level and their profession level would be equivalent to a level 5 warrior. 1 or 2 gnolls would be fine, but the problem was that gnolls usually moved in groups of 3 to 5. If I want to become a wizard, I'll just need a spell book. Soren returned along the way he came. There was a human village nearby. He wanted to see if he could spend the night there. It was too dangerous to sleep alone in the wilderness. If he was ambushed in the middle of the night, he would be done for. Moreover, it was difficult for him to sleep well. He basically couldn't fall asleep in the wilderness. At most, he could only take a nap. Spellbooks were not cheap. If he was a wizard, he would naturally bring one with him. However, if he wanted to advance, he would have to spend money to buy one. It was worth about 150 kindler coins. This was the most common spellbook. A special spell book could be worth thousands of Kindler coins. Bang! The dull sound of a gunshot suddenly spread far and wide in the wilderness. Soren was a little dazed when he heard the gunshot. He quickly hid in the shadows and rushed in the direction of the gunshot. Was it a gnome or a dwarf? Primitive firearms rarely appeared among humans. Alchemy products were strictly controlled, and it was very difficult to buy them in the black market. The power of firearms was not as great as people thought. They were good against ordinary people, but not so good against professionals. Even sniper rifles made by alchemy were not as useful against high-grade professionals as people thought. It was even more difficult to deal with spellcasters. Some people once joked that if they did not make nuclear warheads, they would not be able to threaten legendary spellcasters. Of course, this was just an exaggeration. The churches of the gods had very strict restrictions on alchemy products, second only to the taboo research on life creation. It was said that this was to avoid the catastrophe of the Arcane Empire. There were records that the floating fortress of the Arcane Empire broke the continental shelf into 8 pieces. Even the largest nuclear weapon was not that powerful. Even if nuclear weapons were to be used to destroy the Earth, it would at most destroy humans and creatures. It would not be a big problem for the Earth itself. However, there were spells and alchemy weapons in this world that could directly destroy a plane. They could even sink a piece of the continental shelf to the bottom of the sea. Of course, that was during the Arcane Empire. It was several eras before. The arcanists of that time were very powerful, even more so than the wizards of today. The golems, robots, that the wizards made now. They were the descendants of the Arcane Empire's magic-powered constructs. Soren had seen them when he was exploring the ruins at the bottom of the sea. If someone told him that they were super-powered armors made by humans in the interstellar era, they would have believed it. They had almost been wiped out. At first, it was strange to see them, but they gradually got used to it. If Soren remembered correctly, the dwarven alchemists of Toldra had already started to research rocket technology. In the end, they accidentally injured a black dragon and brought about a devastating disaster. Alchemy products were still very strictly controlled at this time. Since the gods had yet to descend and the churches were unprecedentedly powerful, there were not many people who dared to use alchemy weapons. Grey dwarves. Soren's pupils shrank as he hid in the shadows. About a few hundred meters away, a group of grey dwarves was attacking a wizard. Some of them were holding primitive guns as thick as bowls. This was what attracted Soren's attention. The wizard was surrounded in the middle. There were more than 10 grey dwarven warriors around him. Asterisk bang bang bang. Asterisk 3 consecutive gunshots rang out. The bullets were fired at the wizard, but when they were about a meter away from him, the stone pellets were deflected and flew in another direction. Otherwise, they would have exhausted all their kinetic energy and landed directly at the wizard's feet. High-grade mage armor. Soren stealthily snuck in. His expression was serious. This was the first time he had seen high-grade wizards fight. A grade 3 wizard. His profession should be at least level 10. He didn't seem to be a human wizard. A group of grey dwarven warriors attacked him, but no matter if it was swords, axes, or bullets, they were all blocked at least a meter away from him. This was a wizard's defensive force field. Defensive force fields were divided into 2 types, armor and deflection. Armor was used to block the attack from the front, while deflection was used to deflect the attack. The level 1 mage armor had a defensive strength of 20, which wasn't enough to withstand 1 strike from Soren. However, the defensive strength would increase according to the wizard's level and strength. If a high-grade wizard cast mage armor, it could at least block 3 strikes from Soren. Since he didn't have any rare-grade weapons, his strike could at most deal 20 damage. At that time, many melee professions called it the at-type force field, and complained that the wizards were indeed cheating. Chapter 55. A group of Durgar warriors surrounded him. The wizard's barrier was finally broken. After all, there was a limit to how much damage it could take. However, when a Durgar warrior's axe landed on the wizard's body, it bounced back as if it had hit a marble wall. Stone Skin. Soren already knew the outcome of the battle. Stone Skin could take up to 150 points of damage. They had to surround the wizard and attack him in order to break through his stone skin. There didn't seem to be any high-grade warriors among the Grey Dwarves. Just a bunch of Grade 2 warriors wouldn't be able to kill a high-grade wizard. As expected. One of the Durgar warriors was stunned for a moment, then suddenly turned around and chopped off his companion's head with his axe. Enraged Charm. The Durgar warrior suddenly went on a killing spree. He killed 3 of his companions in one go before being killed by the others. Not a single spellcaster. Soren looked around and pursed his lips. They didn't even bring a priest. Are they trying to get themselves killed? It's about time for a large-scale attack, right? As soon as he finished speaking, a gust of wind suddenly blew across the battlefield. The wizard's speed suddenly became extraordinary. In an instant, he had opened up a distance of nearly 50 meters. He then quickly cast a spell, and a spider web spread out, trapping many Grey Dwarves in it. Spider web was based on strength and dexterity. It could be used to dodge or break free. However, it was difficult for low-grade warriors to dodge a high-grade wizard's web. The wizard quickly cast a spell, and a basketball-sized fireball appeared in front of him. He pointed his finger forward, and the fireball immediately flew out and exploded in the middle of the Durgar warriors. Fireball. Perhaps it was because of the game of pickle in the 21st century, but many people thought that fireball was a spell that could be casually thrown out. However, fireball's level was not low. It was a level 3 evocation spell, and could only be cast by a level 6 wizard. The power of the spell was similar to what was happening right in front of their eyes. With a loud bang, it was as if a grenade had exploded in the middle of the Durgar warriors, and a Durgar warrior was instantly blasted into pieces. The scorching flames wreaked havoc, and the impact of the explosion sent the Grey Dwarves nearby flying. The Durgar warriors who were lucky enough to survive also spat out mouthfuls of blood. Many of their fur and clothes were on fire. Around professional level 12. Soren could roughly estimate the level of the enemy based on the fireball's power. If a wizard of a higher level cast a fireball, at least half of the dwarves would have died from the fireball's attack. The fireball spell was one of the spells he was most familiar with. There was a time when the 5 fireball holy sect was popular. 5 rank 2 magi would cast a fireball spell at the same time. The concentrated area of effect explosion and high-temperature flames would directly wipe out the enemies within a 60-feet radius, leaving behind a crater with a diameter of 3 meters. He shouldn't have many spell slots left, right? Soren furrowed his brows as he glanced at them. His expression showed a hint of eagerness. Even though the spellcasters seemed to have cheats, they were still at the mercy of others after casting their spells. It seemed that the wizard had been fighting for a long time. There were at least 20 or 30 Durgars who had died nearby, and he must have used up a lot of spell slots. Spider spawn. The wizard threw something and it landed on the corpse of a Durgar. Immediately, 2 spider eggs appeared and quickly expanded. Finally, 2 venomous spiders the size of millstones emerged from the dark green liquid. After the venomous spiders appeared, they hissed and then quickly rushed to the other Durgars under the wizard's command. Soon, 2 or 3 warriors were bitten to death. Soren's hair stood on end. He looked at them in shock and murmured, "Dark elves?" Spider spawn was a very obscure level 4 spell. Depending on the wizard's level, it could spawn 1 to 3 spiders in a short time. It mainly depended on the spellcasting materials and the wizard's level. Venomous spiders could be level 6 to 8, and special species of spiders could even be cultivated. Not only were they dangerous, but they also had spell-like abilities. This was a very rare spell that could only be learned by the wizards of the underground world. The ones who were best at it were the dark elf wizards and priests. This was because they believed in the Spider Queen Lolth, an evil and powerful deity. The wizard's protective force field was still intact, and he was not hurt at all. The Durgars finally began to despair. Some of them turned and ran, but they were bitten to death by the swift venomous spiders. Some wanted to fight with their lives, but their heads were blown off by the flying arcane missiles. A high-grade wizard's arcane missile could penetrate a 0.3 centimeter thick steel plate. It was equivalent to the power of a pistol shot from 100 meters away. Even if it did not hit the vital parts, it could still open a hole in the body. Sometimes, it could even penetrate armor. Soren gave up the idea of taking the risk in his heart because the dark elves were very cunning. He definitely had some fatal spells that he had not used yet. From beginning to end, this was a massacre. A high-grade wizard had killed 30 low-grade Duergar warriors in a variety of ways. Apart from the initial danger of almost breaking the protective force field, there was basically nothing they could do to the wizard. Among all the professions, only a sword saint could break the protective force field of a wizard of the same rank in one hit. The other professions would need at least 2 to 3 hits, and it would be even more difficult if there was a gap between their professions. If Soren had a real rare-grade weapon, he would be able to break the protective force field in 1 second. Unfortunately, he could not kill the wizard in 1 hit. The wizard's robe seemed to be a piece of rare-grade equipment, and there must be a protective spell on it that had not been activated yet. Buttons, brooches, rings, gems, headwear, necklaces, amulets. Many of the things that looked like decorations could be the rare-grade equipment that the wizard carried with him. These wizards were so rich that it made one's hair stand on end. A second-grade wizard was worth 5,000 to 6,000 Kindler coins, and a third-grade wizard was worth at least 10,000 Kindler coins. Otherwise, Soren would not have called them wizards. Do I have the confidence to win against him? Soren stared at the wizard who was leaving in the distance. 2 poisonous spiders the size of millstones followed behind him. They could still survive for a while, but they would quickly age and die. The wizard was still very vigilant. The 2 spiders protected him on both sides as he walked towards the plains in the distance. No one knew what his final destination was. After all, the dark elves were not used to the sunlight on the ground. If I can break the protective force field, the wyvern's venom should be able to paralyze him. After all, most wizards don't have high vitality. Unless he has a spell on him beforehand, his fortitude won't be able to pass the test of poison. If the poison takes effect, the failure rate of his spell casting will be at least 50%, and he might not even be able to cast a spell. But the problem is, how many layers of protective force fields does he have? Do I have the confidence to hit him before he can cast a spell? Soren slowly withdrew his curved sword. He had less than 10% confidence in defeating this high-grade wizard, even if he had used a lot of spells. Against wizards, he needed to explode. If he couldn't break through their protective force field in one go, he would be killed by their spells sooner or later. When Soren became a legendary rogue, he had killed hundreds of wizards along the way. He knew the terrible consequences of letting them have time to cast spells. Too bad I didn't learn Shadow Jump. Otherwise, I would have killed him in 1 hit. A rogue with a profession level of 12 and above could learn Shadow Jump if they specialized in shadow magic. They could temporarily enter the shadow plane and return to the material plane through the shadow plane. Although it was only for a second, it was enough for Soren to pass through the protective force field and directly attack the wizard. This was the key to mastering the legendary skill Shadow Realm. Top-tier rogue assassins loved to assassinate across planes. Shadow Step also allowed them to pass through the shadow passage and appear behind the enemy. The wizard's figure was getting farther and farther away. Dark elves wouldn't appear on the surface world for no reason. Soren was sure that something was going to happen, but he didn't know what it was. A wizard with a profession level of 12 had a high status. There weren't many reasons for him to appear in the wilderness alone. Chapter 56. Soren waited for a long time. When he was sure that the wizard had left, he walked towards the corpses of the grey dwarves. There should be something valuable on them. Although the high-ranked wizard didn't think much of it, he was still a thief with a little sister to feed. The more money he had, the better. The little girl would need to spend a lot of money in the future, so he had to prepare some savings. Besides, if he really wanted to spend money, a set of rare-grade equipment would cost him more than 3,000 Kindler coins. There were bloodstains everywhere on the ground, and it seemed like a sudden battle had taken place. Internal conflict? Soren looked at the footprints nearby and frowned. It seems like they were on the same side at first. I don't know why they suddenly started fighting. The footprints were very neat, as if a group of people were protecting something as they moved forward. The footprints behind him started to get messy. When a person was running at full speed, the footprints would naturally be different from when they were walking. Soren tried to reconstruct the scene in his mind, but he could only vaguely tell that the Grey Dwarves had suddenly attacked. Because there were traces of second-grade warriors charging on the ground, they were able to stimulate their potential in a short period of time and burst forward with astonishing speed. Even an ordinary warrior could reach the speed of an Olympic champion. What's this? Soren reached out and picked up a shard. He then turned over the 3 corpses and found a Grey Dwarf with a hole in his chest. There were traces of corrosion around the wound. Acid arrow? Soren carefully took off the ring on the corpse's finger, and a look of surprise appeared on his face. So they brought a wizard with them, but he was killed in an instant. There was a wizard in the Grey Dwarf's team. However, he was only a second-grade wizard, around level 5. Perhaps because the battle had happened so suddenly, he didn't have time to react before the high-ranked wizard killed him with an acid arrow. Soren touched the ring, and a faint glow of magic appeared on it. The smile on his face became more and more obvious. This was a low-ranked wizard's ring, and it could store an additional level 1 or 2 spells. It's worth at least 1,200 Kindler coins. Soren put the ring away and continued to rummage through the dead dwarf's body. He thought to himself, he didn't even touch the dead bodies of his peers. Either he's too rich to care, or there's something very important that he can't afford to delay. What else happened during this period of time? Damn it! Why didn't you pay more attention to the changes in the situation? Soren quickly took out a multidimensional bag. It was also a low-level multidimensional bag. Even though a rank 2 Magus wealth wasn't low, it still wasn't considered a tycoon. There were a lot of things inside, and not many of them were valuable. However, there was one thing that Soren really wanted. That was a spell book. The Grey Dwarf Wizard spellbook was a thick black book with mysterious runes engraved on the outside. It wouldn't be damaged by natural causes and could be maintained for a long time. Soren flipped to a page. It was filled with densely packed runes, many of which he couldn't recognize. Since he didn't have the arcane text recognition ability, he could only use his experience to determine the spells that were copied from the book. The first spell was the Giant Transformation spell. It could double the size of a creature and increase the user's strength by 2, but it would also decrease the user's agility by 2. If one had a metamagic ability, this spell could also be used on certain areas to double the size of certain things. Of course, this effect wasn't created by the natives of the storyline. It was created by someone who had spent a lot of time combining metamagic abilities. It could also be used together with the shrinking spell. The second spell was the Arcane Missile spell. It was one of the most common spells used by wizards because it only took 1 second to cast. Soren didn't recognize 1 or 2 of the spells that were recorded, but he could still remember most of them. They were Charm Person, Burning Hand, Rainbow Spray, Mage Armor, Shield, Web, Brute Force, and Flame Arrow. Each spell was recorded on more than 10 pages. Of course, the spells didn't have to be that long. There were also many diagrams, some of which were even 3-dimensional. These were the legendary spell models. After a wizard copied a spell onto a spellbook, they would spend a period of time to analyze and construct it. It wasn't as simple as copying a spell onto a spellbook. According to their talent and intelligence, a wizard would need a long period of time to understand the spell and construct a spell model in their brain. Finally, they would connect their perception to the magic net and form a spell slot to record it. The spell model would be stored in their brain. After casting the spell, they would need to use up the energy gathered through the magic net and memorize the spell model again. It was a simple analogy. A spell model created by a wizard was like a bullet. It needed to be loaded into a spell slot created by the magic net. The bullet would be shot out and the spell would disappear. The spell model would disappear and the wizard would need to memorize it again through a spellbook. Unless the wizard's talent was so good that they could recall a complicated circuit board without the help of notes. There couldn't be a single mistake in the process of memorizing the spell model. If there was a mistake, the spell would backfire. The higher the level of the spell, the more severe the backfire. It could even explode the wizard's brain. In Soren's memory, apart from advanced arcanists, there weren't many people who could memorize spells without the help of a spellbook. Most arcanists had around 25 points of intelligence, which was equivalent to a biological computer. The memory of a normal person, even an excellent wizard, couldn't reach that level. This was why they had to carry a spellbook with them at all times. Mastering spells took a long time. A wizard with 18 points of intelligence would need at least half a month to learn a level 1 spell. However, it was much easier to memorize the spell after learning it. All they needed to do was spend some time meditating after casting the spell, and they could recreate the spell model. Therefore, the number of spells a wizard could learn was limited. Normally, a high-grade wizard would know many spells, while a low-grade wizard would know very few. Only a legendary wizard would have enough time and energy to learn more spells. What's this? Sauron took out a special roll of paper. After opening it, he took a look and quickly put it away. There was a symbol of 3 tentacles on it. If he remembered correctly, it was called Shadow Tentacles. It was a level 4 spell that could summon 3 tentacles of energy to bind the enemy. The dwarf wizard didn't record it in his spellbook, which meant he was probably a wizard below level 7. A wizard's value was really high. Soren calculated the value of the loot. It was worth more than 2,000 Kindler coins. Woo! While Soren was happily rummaging through the other corpses, a wolf's howl came from afar. He sped up and put everything into the multidimensional bag he just found. He then came to the corpses of the dwarves with primitive firearms. So it's a stone pellet gun. He picked up an alchemy weapon, weighed it in his hand, and then stuffed it into his multidimensional bag. This gun was as thick as an adult's arm, and it was made of polished stone bullets. It was a relatively low-level alchemy gun, and some dwarves would be equipped with it. Because of its primitive craftsmanship, its shooting range and accuracy were average, and its firing speed was not fast. Sometimes, its power was not as good as a crossbow or a longbow, especially the longbows of some human-like races. Its effective shooting range was more than 300 meters, and it could penetrate half a centimeter thick steel plate. It was like a sniper rifle. The craftsmanship of this primitive gun was similar to that of the 18th century. There were even better guns in the hands of the dwarves of Toteldry. Due to their inferior physique, these dwarves were very dedicated to alchemy research. Unfortunately, these weapons couldn't defeat a black dragon with a monster level of 24. In the end, the whole city was destroyed by the dragon's breath. It was estimated that this would happen in about a year. The howls of the wolves were getting closer and closer. Soren hurriedly cleaned up the corpses and headed toward the road. He didn't want to fight a pack of wolves right now. The sky was getting darker and darker, and many wild creatures were starting to move. The smell of blood here would attract many carnivores. As Soren was leaving, he saw a pair of ghostly green eyes in the forest. It was a Knoll scout. They could smell blood within a 1-kilometer radius, and they would spread out when hunting. When they found their prey, they would summon their companions through a special sound. It was likely that these wolves would have to fight the Knolls. There would be a carnival tonight, so it was better to stay away from them. Chapter 57. Any high-grade profession could be understood as a superhuman. Profession level 10 and above basically had 1 or 2 supernatural abilities. For example, the droll just now had some kind of spell on her body, which was why she could jump between trees. Soren was not curious enough to chase after her. It was normal to meet strangers in the wilderness. Some would talk for a short while, but most would just pass by. As long as the other party did not have any bad intentions, both parties would just nod at each other. Droll did not like to communicate with ordinary people, not even professionals. They were solitary and had their own goals. Most of them had strong beliefs and were neutral in their behavior. Sometimes, they would attack anyone. In their eyes, balance was higher than good and evil, because they believed that good and evil in the world were relative. They were like a group of people who advocated inaction, but their aggressiveness was not weak at all. Many people who destroyed the nature of the forest would be mercilessly executed by them. There was a period of time when human alchemy research was popular, mainly because of the discovery of the ruins of the Arcane Empire. Many wizards found high-end alchemy knowledge from it, and they even developed a construction factory. However, the pollution caused by magic energy alchemy destroyed the water source, polluted the earth, killed animals, and destroyed the forest. This eventually led to the anger of the droll group in the world. Terrible storms and lightning shrouded the whole new alchemy city, and in the end, everything was turned into ashes. There were not many records left of that battle. It was only known that the droll defeated the army of steel golems. More than 10 legendary droll fought at the same time, including the powerful Storm Lord. The wizards were badly hurt in this battle. One legendary wizard died, and 2 legendary wizards were forced to turn into liches. Research on magic energy alchemy became a taboo. In order to appease the angry droll, the human world's church began to increase the restrictions on magic energy alchemy. This was because the place where the alchemy city was built, the river was still full of black pollution. The nearby land was not suitable for human survival, and drinking the water would cause metal poisoning. The droll stubbornly believed that this evil alchemy research would eventually destroy nature, causing irreparable damage to the environment, and eventually bring disaster to the whole world. So, even for the dwarves and gnomes, some alchemy research was still carried out in secret. Most of the wizards were not on good terms with the droll, because many of their academic studies were rejected by the droll. Even now, there were still droll hiding in the dark to monitor the wizards' actions, preventing them from carrying out some terrible experiments that could cause large-scale natural disasters. Sometimes, they would also take care of the plagues and diseases spread by the fallen. Soren walked back along the road. Soon, he saw the village that he had seen at the beginning. Torches were lit on all sides of the village, and he could vaguely see the defense of the arrow towers. "Who is it?" a sturdy man shouted. Soren's figure emerged from the night. He raised his hands to show that he wasn't holding any weapons and said, "Human. A traveling adventurer. I just encountered a group of kobolds and am a little injured. I hope I can rest here for the night." After seeing Soren's appearance, the man on the watchtower relaxed a little. He shouted down, and soon a man wearing leather armor appeared. He seemed to be the captain of the militia here. It was a man with a full beard, estimated to be in his 30s or 40s. He frowned and looked at Soren, then asked, "Are you alone? It's not suitable for a person to move around in the wilderness." This was a former adventurer, and he obviously had a lot of experience. Although he knew Soren's profession, he was still very vigilant. "Yes, I'm alone." Soren put down his hands and replied, "I want to train my abilities and find the possibility of further improvement. So I'm alone in the wilderness." The captain hesitated for a moment, then waved his hand to signal the others to open the gate. He then said, "You can rest here for the night, but I hope you won't cause us any trouble." "There won't be any trouble," Soren smiled and said in a deep voice, "I'll leave tomorrow to hunt the nearby monsters. If it's possible, I hope you can tell me the distribution of the nearby monsters." The creatures in the wilderness naturally wouldn't just stay in one place. Only the natives in the area knew where they lived, so it was important to explore the wilderness and gather information. Sometimes, it could save a lot of trouble. The heavy gate of the stronghold slowly opened. 5 or 6 adult men stood nearby with weapons in their hands. Their eyes were still very vigilant as they looked at Soren. They were slightly relieved when they saw that Soren did not make any movements after coming in. The captain climbed down from the watchtower and looked at Soren from head to toe. His eyes fell on his bandaged wounds, then he said, "It's rare to see a lone adventurer like you. I didn't expect a rogue to be like a monk." Soren smiled and didn't answer the question. The captain waved his hand to his companions, then pointed to the side and said, "Stranger. We can't trust you completely. so no one will take you in for the night. There's a firewood shed over there. If you don't mind, you can stay there for the night. I'll have someone send you some hot soup and food." Soren nodded and bowed slightly. "Thank you very much. I just need a place where I can sleep without worry. After all, it's easy to be ambushed in the wilderness." The captain nodded and asked a young man to lead him there. After Soren left, an adult man next to him said, "Captain? Is he okay? He's a stranger after all. He should be fine." The captain looked behind him and said in a low voice, "I'll go and test him later to see if he really killed a group of kobolds. It's getting more and more dangerous here. If someone can kill some of the monsters, we'll be under less pressure." The wilderness was dangerous. They built a village here to avoid a lot of taxes, but they also had to face a lot of trouble. Soon, the captain of the militia came over with 2 men. Soren rested on the soft grass and bandaged the wound on his leg. It was almost healed. There shouldn't be any problems tomorrow, and it wouldn't affect his upcoming battle. The armed forces of this village weren't weak. Soren saw a few second-grade warriors, and there should be experienced adventurers among them. They brought him some hot soup, some dry bread, and some pickled vegetables. The one who brought them over was a chubby girl with freckles on her face. She looked at Soren curiously and blushed slightly when she saw his handsome face. She seemed like a simple village girl. She seemed to want to stay and listen to what they had to say, but the captain glared at her and she obediently went back to sleep. Before she left, she looked back at Soren. Young people like her were always curious about adventurers. Soren thanked her softly and took a sip of the soup. There were mushrooms and vegetables in it, and the bread needed to be soaked in it. It was natural to feel uncomfortable eating too much dry food. As he ate, he answered the other party's questions and probing questions. This wasn't surprising. After all, he was a stranger. "You said you killed a large group of kobolds?" The young man next to him looked doubtful, as if he didn't believe Soren had such strength. He wasn't interested in explaining, so he pulled out his curved sword and cut a piece of wood into 4 pieces. This time, the young man finally shut his mouth and looked at him with a trace of respect. Soren had used up a lot of energy. He finished the soup and bread and chewed some jerky before he stood up and said, "I want to know about the distribution of monsters nearby. Can you provide me with some information?" The captain had already put down his doubts and nodded. "No problem. There are many monsters around here, and we've been hoping that someone can deal with them. You can come here to rest at any time. I'll have someone prepare food and a place for you to sleep." "Ugh. It's late now. If you don't mind, you can sleep in my house for the night. I'll get someone to prepare a room for you in 2 days." Soren smiled and shook his head. He patted the pile of grass and said, "No need. This place is good. I'm used to it. Now tell me where the monsters are." Chapter 58. The sky was just beginning to brighten. A silhouette shuttled through the dense forest. The forest was truly a primeval forest, and there were no signs of roads at all. If it weren't for Soren's sturdy clothes, his clothes would have been torn a few times already. There were all kinds of small animals in the forest. Squirrels and rabbits were the most common, followed by all kinds of birds. It had to be said that a place without human activity was full of vitality. No wonder the druids were so against others destroying the forest. They had even fought several times because of this, and killed many people. Soren quickly arrived at the edge of the forest, following the directions given by the militia captain. It was around noon. There were obvious signs of logging nearby. Intelligent creatures in the wilderness would build their own settlements, and some large groups of gnolls would even build their own camps. Soren didn't dare to get too close because his current stealth couldn't achieve the same effect as invisibility. It was just that he would become hazy in the shadows, and no one would be able to see him unless they looked carefully. As for sneaking up behind an enemy, that required skill and the environment, especially when dealing with hostile creatures. Invisibility didn't really mean that one would disappear. Enemies with sharp senses could still sense that someone was approaching. The biggest advantage of stealth was that one could hide in the shadows at any time. Most of the time, once one left the enemy's line of sight, it wouldn't be easy for them to find you again. Although backstab was a powerful ability, it required a lot of conditions to activate it. Soren followed the shadows and circled around the area. He found 3 gnoll guards. Large groups of gnolls included the old, the weak, women, and children. When the adults went out to hunt, some would stay behind to guard them. The gnolls didn't have houses in their settlements. They were just surrounded by a circle of wood. They knew how to make fires and equipment, but they were limited to making leather armor. Female jackallans would peel off the skin of their prey and sew it into leather armor using crude methods. Some gnolls would use weapons in battle, and those who hadn't advanced would use claws and teeth. There are 3 guards. There should be quite a few of them. Soren took out his crossbow and loaded it with a poison bolt. It was impossible to sneak in during the day because the vision was too good. The gnolls would be able to spot him as soon as they saw him. He needed 150 points in stealth to achieve the same effect as invisibility, and he had to be in the shadows. He was still a few dozen points away from that. Although the invisibility effect was invisible to the eyes, the slight sound of movement and the flow of air were still there. Therefore, to deal with enemies who had the blind warfare specialty and high perceptive sense, the skill points needed to be very high. Soren's goal was to earn slaughter EXP, not to clear out this group of gnolls. Naturally, there was no need for him to attack the camp. He circled around and hid in the nearby bushes, then crawled on the ground and slowly crept towards the camp. Even with invisibility, it would be useless to walk over directly. The footprints and the things you stepped on would expose your position. It would be even more obvious if there was water on the ground. When wizards cast invisibility, they would combine it with lighten and instant slither. There were some creatures in the shadow plane that were permanently invisible. Soren had fought against them before, and they were very difficult to deal with. The gnolls were wearing leather armor. Soren frowned and moved closer. If he didn't hit any vital points, the damage of the crossbow would be reduced. Even if he didn't want to kill the enemy with the crossbow, he still needed to ensure that the poison could seep into the enemy's blood. Swoosh! A gnoll suddenly screamed. The nearby guards were alarmed, and there was even a commotion from within the camp. Soren quickly reloaded his crossbow and shot at another gnoll. The wyvern's poison would take effect quickly. He pulled out his curved sword and rushed over. These gnolls were level 3 creatures, and often had the strength of a level 1 to level 3 warrior. It wouldn't be easy to deal with them. Awoo! Faced with Soren's surprise attack, the gnolls' first reaction wasn't to surround him, but to howl and call for their companions. The gnolls wouldn't stay in the camp all the time. They would search for prey during the day. If it was a wild beast, they would try to kill it. If it was a humanoid creature, they would secretly follow it, and then ambush it in the evening or night. As carnivores, they had huge appetites. No matter how much prey there was, they could finish it all. When they were very hungry, they would also eat grass and mushrooms. Gnolls spent most of their time hunting and preparing to hunt. A gnoll's appetite was equivalent to that of an adult tiger. They were the most greedy and hungry wild creatures. There were 3 adult gnolls. One used claws and fangs, one was equipped with a bone crusher hammer, and one used a simple mace. Soren's advantage wasn't that obvious. These creatures were around 2 meters tall and weighed around 300 pounds. Their heads were similar to a coyote's, and their skin was mostly gray. The color of their mane was messy, but their overall color was darker. Their strength and agility were higher than humans, and could reach 15 points or more. However, their intelligence was lower. There were also priests who worshipped the gnoll god, but wizards and sorcerers were rare. A wolf howl came from afar. Soren raised his curved sword and slashed down. The sword slashed at the gnoll's arm, cutting off half of its claw. There was a muffled sound of wind breaking behind him. He had no time to dodge, so he could only roll forward. At the same time, he slashed at the gnoll's ankle. There was only 1/3 of the wyvern's venom left, and he had already smeared it on his scimitar. Bam! The mace hit the ground, creating a crater. If it had hit the head, it would have splashed brain matter. Many gnolls liked to use heavy weapons because it was convenient to crush bones. Bone marrow was the most delicious food for gnolls. A jackalon that was obviously smaller in size rushed out, along with 2 small aardwolves. Shadow strike. Soren had already predicted the number of enemies. He turned around and killed the first gnoll that was poisoned. A row of data appeared: Gnoll warrior killed. Target killed. Obtained 270 slaughter EXP. Whoosh. The sound of a weapon piercing through the air was heard. Soren waved his sword to block the attack, and his figure stepped back slightly. In an instant, he kicked his legs and rushed forward, directly crashing into the gnoll's arms. A disgusting stench and fishy smell assailed his nostrils. Without hesitation, he stabbed his curved sword into the gnoll's abdomen, then twisted his waist and directly cut a 20-centimeter long wound. A large amount of blood and intestines overflowed. The gnoll was severely injured, but it didn't die. It stuffed its intestines back in with its claws and swung the bone crusher mace again. A throwing knife was thrown. It hit the gnoll's throat in an instant. This was the last straw that broke the enemy's back. The gnoll roared and fell to the ground. Blood and intestines spilled on the ground. The coyote howled and pounced on Soren's leg. Soren twisted his body and kicked the coyote away. Then, he used his curved sword to block the coyote's attack from the side. The heavy force forced him to kneel on one knee and deflect the coyote's weapon. At the same time, he twisted his body and stepped forward, cutting a wound on the coyote's leg with his curved sword. Another coyote pounced on him and bit his throat with its bloody mouth. Soren smashed the gnoll's nose with the hilt of his sword. Blood splashed out. Although the wound wasn't fatal, the gnoll howled in pain and retreated. Wolf howls could be heard from afar. It seemed that the gnolls were coming back from their hunt. Soren rushed toward the last gnoll warrior. The wyvern's venom had begun to take effect, and the gnoll's reaction speed had obviously slowed down. Die. Soren slid forward on his knees to avoid the gnoll's mace. He then held his curved sword with both hands and slashed at the gnoll's leg. The gnoll lost its balance. Blood spurted out, and one of its legs was cut off. Clang! The smaller she-wolf pounced on Soren and pushed him to the ground. Its sharp fangs were about to bite his throat. However, Soren turned his head in an instant. The she-wolf bit into the leather armor on his shoulder. The sharp fangs pierced through the leather armor, but it didn't hurt the shoulder. It only bit through the skin. Puff! Blood splashed. Soren kicked the she-wolf with all his strength. As he kicked the she-wolf away, he held his curved sword and chopped off the head of the gnoll. Swoosh! He calmly reloaded his crossbow and killed the last gnoll guard that crawled over. The gnoll screamed and ran away, but he shot it in the waist. The gnolls in the distance had returned. The sound was about 500 meters away from Soren. He gripped his curved sword tightly and entered the camp. A group of gnolls stared at him fiercely. They let out threatening growls from time to time. Blood splashed. Soren swung his sword and killed 5 gnolls that were less than 2 years old. He then quickly ran into the forest and blended into the shadows. The battle had just begun. He wanted to make the gnolls lose their minds. Only then could he kill more of them. Chapter 59. 1, 2, 3. The gnolls that had gone out to hunt returned to the camp. The strong leader with a scar on his face found the bodies outside and roared angrily. It had fought with adventurers before, and its intelligence as a humanoid creature made it realize that adventurers had attacked their camp. These adventurers had mercilessly slaughtered the descendants of their tribe, just as they had mercilessly eaten the poor humans. There were only a few enemies, and they ran away as soon as they noticed their return. 12 gnolls gradually gathered. This was a medium-sized gnoll group. More than half of them were adult gnolls, a third of them were warriors, and a small number of them were newborns. With their talents, they had tamed 3 aardwolves, which could be used as helpers when they hunted, and they could also be used as food reserves when they ran out of food. For gnolls, hunger could overwhelm everything. Even the weakest of their kind could be turned into food when they needed it. They were born warriors and scouts, and they could follow the smell of blood. The leader of the gnolls came to the dead body of the female wolf. There was not much difference between males and females in the group, only a difference in size. Male gnolls were usually stronger, and female gnolls would only show some obvious characteristics when they were breastfeeding. It leaned over and sniffed the she-wolf's fangs, which were stained with Sauron's blood. Then it lifted the she-wolf, which weighed 200 to 300 pounds, with one hand and let all the gnolls smell it. They could remember the smell of blood for half a day, and they could follow the smell of blood within a 1-kilometer radius. Revenge. This was the instinct of humanoid creatures. Just like how humans would take revenge for their companions who had been eaten, they would also take revenge for their dead pups. The howls of the wolves rose and fell one after another. The gnolls began to follow the smell of blood. They were not the strongest creatures in the wilderness, but they were definitely the most vicious and annoying ones. The instincts of wolves allowed them to form packs and obey the orders of their own kind. Their innate bestial instincts allowed them to hunt and kill their prey. Adult gnolls had a monster level of 3, and as long as they succeeded in evolving, they would be close to grade 2 warriors. When they moved in packs, they would even hunt more dangerous creatures when they were hungry. The only thing that determined the size of a gnoll group was food. As long as there was enough food, a female wolf could give birth to more than 10 pups in a year. If there was a shortage of food, only the leader had the right to mate. In order to ensure that the strongest offspring would be born, the other Jackalen members would not be able to give birth to offspring, and they would have to raise them together. This was very similar to many wolf packs. In the dense forest, Soren's figure was moving quickly. In the wilderness, only rangers could easily shake off gnolls. They had the ability to track the scent of blood, so it was only a matter of time before they discovered Soren's tracks. These were just gnolls in the material plane. In the outer plane, there were even gnolls called bloodthirsters. They could track the smell of blood within a range of 10 kilometers. These creatures were dangerous predators and assassins. Their diet included low-level dragons. A group of jackalans rushed into the forest and followed the scent of blood. Soren needed more favorable terrain. He could face more than 10 kobolds at once, but he could not face more than 10 gnolls at the same time. His stamina was gradually depleted as he ran. Soren's 20 points of constitution ensured his stamina. On the contrary, the gnolls began to slow down after chasing for 1 or 2 kilometers. The dense forest greatly affected one's speed. Even gnolls could not sprint at high speeds. Soren was also affected, but he had the excellent jumping ability and reflexes brought by his dexterity. His sense of balance, which was beyond the limits of a normal person, allowed him to avoid most obstacles. When there was a bush in front of him, he could even jump up and use the tree branches as leverage. It was as if one had been buffed with lighten, while the other had to run on the ground. The terrain in front of him gradually widened, and a mountain peak appeared in front of him. It was a 90-degree cliff, and there were some 3-foot-wide faults. Soren suddenly jumped up and grabbed the rock with both hands to climb up. Just like a climbing madman who challenged the limits of human beings in his previous life, Soren climbed all the way up the cliff with an unusually agile speed, and then stood about 20 meters above the ground. The area where he could move around was very small. He could climb all the way to the top of the mountain from the side. The mountain peak was not very high, and there were only bare rocks on top. Soren applied some ointment to the wound on his shoulder, and then began to reload his crossbow. He put the bolts one by one into the small pouch on his waist, where he originally stored throwing knives. The best way to deal with jackalans was to avoid open terrain and be surrounded by them. If a group of jackalans surrounded him, even a high-grade warrior would have to take a few hits, let alone a tier 2 thief. Traps were only useful in specific areas. Adventurers rarely spent too much time setting up traps in the wilderness. Rogues were more like warriors who relied on their dexterity to fight in the wilderness. This was why there was an advanced branch of the Rogue Blade Master class, which was a very powerful AoE class. The bushes in the distance shook, and then a group of strong jack-o'-lanterns came out. The leader was a jack-o'-lantern with a scar on his face. The scar extended from his forehead to the side of his face. If it had been a little more slanted, his eyes would have been destroyed. They're finally here. Soren hung the crossbow on his waist, and then took out a bloody wolf's head from his multidimensional pouch. It was the head of a jack-o'-lantern cub. He put it in his pocket before he left. Awoo. 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 The howls of the jack-o'-lanterns rose and fell one after another. The jack-o'-lantern's eyes were bloodshot. They howled and pounced on him, wanting to climb up the wall and tear him to pieces. Taunt successful. Swoosh. A crossbow bolt flew out, and the knoll at the front staggered, rolling and hitting the cliff. Soren calmly reloaded the crossbow, and then hid behind a rock. He then aimed at the jack-o'-lanterns again, and shot an arrow at its head. It hit the skull, and the arrow directly nailed into it. A row of data appeared: killed jack-o'-lantern warrior. Dealt 36 lethal damage. Target killed. Received 320 slaughter EXP, it had a range of 20 meters. The base damage of the crossbow could reach up to 20, and if it hit a vital point, it would instantly kill the target. The jack-o'-lanterns were fast climbers, but it wasn't easy to climb the 90-degree cliff. Before the jack-o'-lanterns could reach him, Soren had already finished reloading the crossbow, and shot an arrow from above. The jack-o'-lanterns that were climbing had no room to dodge. One of them was shot in the neck and fell down, dying in an instant. Another one was shot in the forehead, and died on the spot. Awoo. The jack-o'-lantern's leader howled, and the other jack-o'-lanterns finally realized that the terrain was very unfavorable for them. Some of them hid in the blind spots of Soren's shooting range, while the others flanked Soren from both sides. They climbed up the side of the cliff, preparing to ambush Soren from both sides and from above. Damn it. Their reactions are fast. Soren put away the crossbow. He threw the head of the jack-o'-lantern pup down, and then climbed up the cliff. Although the jack-o'-lanterns weren't very intelligent, they wouldn't just stand there and wait for him to kill them one by one. If the jack-o'-lanterns attacked him, Soren could kill 5 or 6 of them first, but if they surrounded him from the side, he had no choice but to change his position. Soren was able to jump up to the second floor, and his jumping ability was even better than the elves. He jumped up and grabbed onto a rock, then did a 360-degree flip and landed on the top of the cliff. He quickly picked up the crossbow, reloaded it, and shot at the jack-o'-lanterns that were climbing up the cliff. The jack-o'-lanterns were alert enough to dodge, and the crossbow hit a rock. Clang! Soren wasn't surprised. He pulled out his scimitar, looked at the jack-o'-lanterns that were surrounding him, and rushed towards the closest one. The terrain here was good. If the jack-o'-lanterns were grouped together, he could slowly kill them. If they were scattered, he could kill them alone. At least he didn't have to face 3 or 5 of them at once. It was a pity that he didn't have the forest walk ability, or he would be able to kill them in the forest. The Elven Ranger's favorite thing to do was to jump from tree to tree and kill enemies with their longbows. A jack-o'-lantern gave him nearly 300 slaughter EXP, and he would be able to take out half of them. Chapter 60. I woke up at 6:00 and dreamt of many recommendation tickets. Please vote for me. Thank you. Clang. Soren jumped down from the 5-meter-tall rock and slashed at the Knoll warrior's head. The Knoll blocked the scimitar with its weapon, but was forced to take 2 steps back from the impact. It lost its balance and lost its balance. Soren didn't care about the numbness in his legs. He lunged forward and slashed at the Knoll's chest. Blood splattered out and landed on his face. The smell of blood stimulated Soren's thirst for battle. He kicked the Knoll in the ass, and the Knoll's whole body twitched. He slid down and stabbed forward. Soren stabbed his scimitar into the Knoll's chest and kicked it down the cliff. The Knoll's tenacious life force was still struggling in midair. It fell to the ground with a thud and died. Soren sheathed his scimitar. He glanced at the gnolls that were getting closer and closer. He grabbed onto a rock and prepared to escape. Clang! The sound of wind breaking could be heard behind him. One of the gnolls saw that it couldn't catch up to Soren and threw its weapon at him. It almost hit him in the head. Gnolls couldn't use long-range weapons with their claws, so apart from a small number of advanced scouts, most of them used close-range weapons. Soren judged the direction and rolled down the cliff. When 3 to 5 gnolls reached the top, he was already halfway up the mountain. Swoosh! He calmly reloaded his crossbow and hit another gnoll in the eye. However, the other gnoll only hit its arm. The gnoll howled and pulled the crossbow out. Soren wasn't in a hurry to win. He was taking advantage of the gnolls because they weren't as agile as he was and they didn't have his 20 points of vitality. The gnolls that had been chasing after them all the way to the top of the mountain were already panting heavily. Although they looked furious, there was nothing they could do to Soren. This was because the despicable human in front of them didn't even fight them head-on. He only used the distance and the terrain to shoot at them with his crossbow. Fly a kite. Heavy armor warriors hated this way of fighting the most. Because the movement speed of the heavy armor was not fast, it was very easy for the enemy to kill him with long-range weapons. If you chase him, he will run. If you run, he will chase after you. Soren maintained a distance of at least 15 meters between the two of them. Even if they split up and surrounded him, there was still enough space for him to move around on the bare mountaintop. Gnolls were humanoid creatures. They did not have the jumping ability of werewolves, but their strength and speed were higher than that of ordinary people. Soren didn't care about him at all. He quickly reloaded his crossbow and fired at the other 3 jackallans who were running over aggressively. A blood-curdling scream rang out. One of the gnolls was hit in the chest, and the other 2 gnolls were enraged. They didn't care about the terrain, and directly charged at Soren. They even wanted to hug him and roll down the cliff. In an instant, Soren lowered his waist and dodged the gnolls by a hair's breadth. The gnolls that were charging at him screamed and fell down the cliff. The 2 or 3 gnolls gradually approached. Soren put away his crossbow expressionlessly, then pulled out his scimitar and rushed in the direction of one of the gnolls. Faced with the bone crusher mace, he twisted his body and dodged it. The sharp shards of the bone crusher mace scratched his back, leaving a bloody gash. But he also dodged the attack at the same time. He twisted his scimitar and cut a wound under the gnoll's arm. Bang! The mace hit a rock, and debris flew everywhere. Soren kicked up the dust with his foot, then dove down and chopped at the gnoll's waist. The gnoll's skull was very hard. It couldn't be pierced without a crossbow, and the scimitar couldn't be used to suppress the gnoll's strength. Blood and intestines spilled all over the ground. The gnoll that was enraged didn't care about the wound on its waist. It opened its mouth and bit at Soren's neck. Bang! Soren held his scimitar with both hands and twisted it. When the gnoll's bloody mouth was getting closer and closer, he gritted his teeth and let out a roar, then rammed into the gnoll's head. Several teeth flew out, and Soren rammed his head into the gnoll's head. While he was a little dizzy from the impact, the gnoll's face was also covered in blood. Soren's extraordinary physique was on full display. He was only dizzy for less than a second before he recovered. He pulled out his scimitar and chopped off a gnoll's head. Blood dripped down from his forehead. The gnoll's teeth had scratched his forehead, and the wound was about an inch long. It was simple and brutal. Technique wasn't about how many tricks you could play. It was about how you used the most direct and effective way to fight in a moment of life and death. Blood dripped down from the corner of his eyes. The gnoll's blood had splashed into his eye sockets. Soren's eyes were red. He wiped his eyes with his hand, then took a deep breath and held his scimitar. He stood still and waited. There weren't many gnolls left. He had just killed 7 or 8, and the enraged gnoll leader was already charging at him. As long as he could kill it, the gnolls would quickly crumble. The continuous battles had already consumed a lot of his stamina. There was no point in continuing to run. He still had 5 shadow strikes that he hadn't used yet. They were spells that ignored physical defense, and they were more than enough for him to kill the gnoll leader in a short amount of time. Soren's figure was a little hazy in the shadows. When the enraged gnoll leader appeared, he pounced at it like a cheetah. Clang! The gnoll leader blocked Soren's scimitar with its mace, but the invisible energy corroded its arm, and its flesh was stained with a dark gray color. Shadow strikes. As long as it came into contact with the target, it would deal energy damage that ignored physical defense. 6 points of shadow strike damage wasn't enough to kill, but it was enough to change the enemy's attack rhythm. Soren slashed down with his scimitar. As he attacked, he also activated the shadow energy within his body. This was a spell-like ability that could fuse with the shadow energy. It could even transform a thief into a half-shadow supernatural being. Clang! The gnoll leader blocked Soren's attack again, but its body couldn't help but tremble. The shadow energy continued to corrode the target, and 12 points of shadow strike damage was equivalent to a cut. It finally noticed the strange energy in Soren's attack, and retreated when Soren swung his scimitar at it again. The condensed shadow energy dissipated, and Soren could only use shadow strikes twice. The shadow energy didn't take long to gather, and if it didn't reach the target, it would quickly dissipate. The gnolls nearby were already charging at him. Soren could even hear the howls of the gnolls behind him. Sword form, heavy slash. Soren's muscles tightened, and he focused all his strength into a single line. In an instant, he jumped and slashed. The gnoll leader's wrist was cut off, and then he twisted his body and swung his scimitar horizontally at its head. Blood spurted out like a fountain, and the gnoll leader's head was directly cut off. The headless corpse raised its mace and wobbled for a moment before falling to the ground with a thump. Roar! Soren picked up the gnoll leader's head with one hand and let out a deafening roar at the approaching gnolls. The wild roar echoed throughout the mountaintop. The gnolls nearby froze, and then they bared their fangs and howled. Their eyes were still fierce, but there was a hint of fear in them. Soren used all his strength to let out another roar, and then he raised the gnoll leader's head high up in the air. He looked around fiercely, and once again tightened his grip on his scimitar. Woo woo woo. Like a frightened wolf, the gnolls' howls suddenly became much quieter. They looked at the few gnolls nearby, and finally felt fear. They turned around and fled into the forest. They were scared. Soren looked at the gnolls who had lost their morale and ran away. He casually threw away the gnoll leader's head, then sat down on the ground and laughed a little nervously. Although the battle had only lasted for about 10 minutes, the high intensity of the battle had already made his hands tremble. If the gnoll's morale hadn't collapsed, he would have had to use his ultimate move. Injury for injury. The drow instructor in the Underdark told him that unless he was prepared to die, it was best not to use it. It was a combat skill that drow assassins would only use when they were on a mission where they had to die. As if remembering his experience in the Underdark, Soren's face once again laughed nervously, then he patted the dust off his face and stood up. He was one of the top violent thieves in the Underdark. Many people thought that he should be a blade master or a berserker, instead of a lurker. But only he knew that in those extremely dangerous places, whether it was the Underdark or the Abyss, where demons were everywhere, a warrior could never live as freely as a rogue. A row of data appeared. The battle is over. After a difficult battle, your skills have improved. You have successfully used taunt on the gnolls. You have successfully used intimidate on the gnolls. Intimidate +10, taunt +5, evasion, roll, +2, evasion, shift, +1, parry +1, survival +2. You have mastered the combat skill, sword form, heavy hack. Chapter 61. 3,950 Slaughter EXP. Even after deducting the 900 EXP he got from killing the kobolds, each advanced gnoll warrior still gave Soren close to 300 Slaughter EXP. These monsters were born with a monster level of 3 and a profession level of 1 or 2. So the Slaughter EXP they got was 10 times more than the kobolds. Of course, it was also more difficult to deal with them. Soren used half a bottle of wyvern venom on them, and it could only last one more battle before it was used up. There was nothing to gain from the gnolls, and the broken weapons were worthless. After resting for a while, Soren headed towards the gnoll's nest. He didn't want to let go of the loot, and the group of gnolls that he scared away probably didn't dare to go back. Soon, he arrived near the nest. The gnolls that ran away didn't come back. These gnolls would become wanderers in the wilderness until they were accepted into the tribe by stronger gnolls. The smell in the nest was terrible, and it was filled with a pungent stench and the smell of blood. Soren saw many skeletons of beasts, humans, and humanoid creatures. There were also traces of bonfires nearby. The gnolls collected their loot in a very messy way, and many of them were stained with blood. He even saw some human skins. The gnolls used the skins of their prey to make simple leather armor. There were many weapons in the nest, and it seemed that they had attacked humans before. Of course, they wouldn't have brought such ordinary weapons. Soren only took out the kindler. There were also some ordinary goods, probably from the caravans that they attacked in the past. There weren't many valuable items. In the end, he found about 100 kindler and 1 or 2 amber stones. What a surprise! These gnolls didn't even have as much money as the kobold sorcerers. Soren washed his hands unhappily, and then put the valuable items in the bag. There was no way he could bring the goods and weapons with him. They were too heavy, and he couldn't fit them in the bag. When he returned at night, he would tell the village that maybe they would be interested in sending someone to take them away. These were all daily necessities, and they could use them if he brought them back. Soren was ready to leave. But just as he was about to leave, a light caught his attention. Huh! He carefully pried open the stone wall with his scimitar, and found a gem hidden inside. Shit! Soren couldn't help but curse. He took out the gem, held it in his hand, and looked at it under the sun. He immediately said, I didn't expect these guys to have such a good thing. They really hid it well. It was a pink diamond. It was only half the size of a fingernail and had not been polished. If it was not for the light that attracted Soren's attention, he would have missed it. Some businessmen would buy this kind of unpolished diamond and bring it back after making money. Firstly, they could carry it with them, which was more discreet than carrying a large amount of gold dirhams. Secondly, they could earn another sum of money after returning to their hometown. Soren. Probably worth 500 or 600 kindler. Soren had never studied the price of diamonds before, but they had always been expensive. Normal diamonds cost about 200 or 300 kindler dollars, and pink diamonds cost about twice as much. This was just a raw diamond that had not been polished. After polishing, it would definitely be smaller, but its value should not be less than 500 kindler coins. Soren put away the pink diamond with a smile. Even though he had looted quite a few valuable items from the corpses of the dwarven adepts, it wasn't convenient for him to sell them. Even a low-grade sorcerer's ring was hard to buy. Whether it was for Vivian or himself, it was a life-saving item. As for the other things, such as the Shadow Tentacle spell scroll, they shouldn't be sold. Although he couldn't use it now, copying scrolls wasn't easy at all. Just the basic materials required could reach hundreds of kindler coins. And it wasn't a 100% success rate. If he didn't count the items he looted from the corpses of the dwarven adepts, Soren's total earnings would only add up to 300 or 400 kindler coins, which was barely enough to buy 1 or 2 rare items. Of course, they would only be low-grade rare items. Even the high-grade ones were frighteningly expensive. Soren looked around again to make sure he didn't miss anything valuable. Only then did he quickly leave the gnoll nest. It was getting late. If he didn't want to camp in the wilderness, it would be best for him to go back now. He should be able to return to the village before nightfall. He would then have a good night's rest and go check out the place where the ogres appeared the next day. Those creatures were even more dangerous than the gnolls. Ogres had a monster level of 5, and most of them had advanced professions. Most of them were warriors, while a few of them could become wizards or sorcerers. If they retained their totemic beliefs, the ogre tribes could even nurture shamans. In fact, they were another type of priest, but they didn't worship gods. Ogre shamans rarely appeared in the wilderness, and they usually played an important role in the tribe. Ogres had a monster level of 6, and there were about 3 to 5 of them in the wilderness. If there was a chance, Soren would try to kill them. If the enemy was too strong, he would give up on his target and move on. Ogre Strength Bracers. This item represented how dangerous they were. An adult ogre had at least 18 points of strength, and if they evolved, they would have 20 points of strength. They could also wield weapons that weighed more than 100 pounds. With Soren's current strength, he wouldn't die if he took a few hits from the gnolls, but if he took a hit from the ogres, he would be dead meat. The only obvious weakness was that the ogres were born slow, and their attack speed wasn't fast. If there weren't many of them, he could rely on his agility to dodge their attacks. Under normal circumstances, adventurers would rather face a large group of gnolls than a small group of ogres. This was because even a strength-type shield warrior would be injured by the ogre's attacks. Ogres loved heavy weapons, and even full body armor was useless. Against these creatures, one couldn't let them get hit. Wherever they hit, they would break. If they were unlucky, it was normal to lose an arm or a leg. Among all the attributes, strength was the one that had the biggest impact on the enemy's damage. Therefore, most of the creatures with higher strength would be harder to challenge, and this was even more so when fighting against the gigantic humans. Soren had experienced this when he hunted down a hill giant. He accidentally brushed against one of the giants, and his arm was broken on the spot. The bone was broken in half, and he used up all his savings to ask a priest to fix the broken bone. However, in the end, he managed to kill the hill giant and finally avenged himself. The night was hazy. Soren went back the way he came, and when he returned to the village, he immediately noticed that the atmosphere was not right. The fully armed militia was guarding the area, and many of them had lit torches. When they saw someone approaching, they immediately drew their bows and let out a sigh of relief when they saw that it was Soren. What happened? Soren walked into the village and asked, "What happened?" The militia captain walked out with a serious expression. He glanced at Soren and said in a deep voice, "Lizard men. The lizard men from the swamp are here. They are well armed, and they ambushed our patrol team. We suffered heavy losses. 2 died, and 5 were injured." Soren's expression suddenly became serious. He looked around and said, "How many people do you have left? Don't count the normal people. You have to be well-equipped and trained warriors." The militia captain hesitated for a moment and said slowly, "There are 30 more. But we still have a lot of adult men in the village. They can fight with weapons." "That's too little," Soren frowned and looked at him and said in a deep voice, "This is not enough to deal with the lizard men. I suggest you move to another place as soon as possible." Chapter 62. Lizard Men. They were one of the most annoying creatures in the swamp. Their numbers were huge, and although they were not as strong as the gnolls, they outnumbered the gnolls by more than 10 times. Basically, a small group of lizard men would have 100 or 200 of them. Once a battle broke out, they would send out dozens or even hundreds of warriors. Most adventurers would not provoke them. There was at least one spellcaster in a lizard man group, either a warlock or a droll. These spellcasters were proficient in taming and enslaving monsters. They could not cast many spells, but they could bring some swamp beasts with them. For example, the swamp lizard. It was a monster with a challenge rating of 6. It was 5 meters long and weighed about 1,500 pounds. "Can you help us?" The girl from last night came over with red eyes. She looked at Soren with hope and said, "You're an adventurer. They all said that you're very strong. You must have a way to deal with these lizard men, right?" Soren shook his head and said seriously, "I'm sorry. I don't have a way. There are a lot of them, and there are many archers. The warriors can't stop them. If we don't leave, they'll kill everyone in the village." Lizard men were similar to humans. They grew some food, and hunting was their main source of meat. Their settlements were a bit like villages, and they were either dug-out caves or simple huts. Human villages in the wilderness had at least a few hundred people, and these lizard men also had a few hundred people. However, there were not many warriors among the humans, but more than 50% of the lizard men were warriors. They also had a lot of archers. Dealing with these creatures was not something that could be done alone. At the very least, there was no one with a high enough profession level to be unparalleled in the crowd. If there was a warrior with a profession level of 15 or above, or a spellcaster with a profession level of 12 or above, let him deal with 50 to 100 lizard men alone, and leave the rest to the others. It should be possible to repel these lizard men. The lizard men were forced to move out of the black swamp. Any place near the water could become their new target. This was a battle for survival, and the process was very cruel. Peaceful coexistence was an extravagant hope. In the end, there would inevitably be a winner who would divide the territory. Human villages would fight over water sources for irrigation, and there would even be deaths, not to mention this kind of interracial territorial competition. Originally, there were tens of millions of Indians living in America, but in the end, less than 1/10 of them were slaughtered. Tens of millions of people were slaughtered in the process. This was only a battle between humans. If the differences between different races were taken into account, the process would be even more bloody. The lizard men would kill all humans, including women and children. This world was very bloody and dark. There was no need to have too many illusions about the level of civilization. Humans had also walked this path step by step. Soren wouldn't risk his life for them. He didn't have the ability, and it wasn't worth it. He could only give his own suggestions. It was up to them whether they wanted to leave or not. They had to bear the consequences themselves. Perhaps because of the lizardman's attack, the militia captain forgot to arrange a place for him to stay. Soren didn't care. He went to the woodshed to rest. Outside, double the number of patrols were arranged. The militia captain was discussing with the village elders whether they should move or not. Leaving home was a very difficult choice. There was a debate between them, but Soren wasn't interested in getting involved. There was a limit to his personal strength if he wasn't at the legendary level. He could deal with a few lizard men, but he couldn't do anything more. So he planned to leave tomorrow and continue to observe the situation. Out of vigilance against the lizard men, Soren didn't fall asleep. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep. They might attack at night. The night was getting darker. Soren didn't fall asleep. He was only in a half-awake state. Suddenly, he heard the sound of something falling to the ground. He instantly opened his eyes and climbed up from the haystack. Clang! Soren unsheathed his curved sword, and then walked out of the house. There were torches outside. Because of the attack during the day, the militia was on high alert. He could also hear the sound of night patrols. In this situation, even he didn't have much confidence in sneaking in, so he couldn't help but feel a little relieved. However, because of his constant vigilance, Soren still walked along the house to the fence. He didn't see any traces of the lizard men. There were also torches on the side. There were always people guarding the watchtower. It was very difficult to sneak in. What is this? Just as Soren was about to go back to sleep, he suddenly stopped. He bent down and looked at the ground. There was a little wet mark on it. It was relatively dry these 2 days, and there was no rain. The ground nearby was dry, but this area was a little wet. He carefully picked up the soil and smelled it. There was a faint fishy smell. It seemed to be left behind by something. Lizard men. Soren's hair stood on end. He rolled over and leaned his back against the wall. He held his curved sword in front of his chest and said, "Lurker." Lizard men lurker. Only advanced lurkers could sneak in without anyone noticing. When they reached 100 points in sneak, they could cast invisibility in the shadows. It was very difficult to see them with the naked eye. Not good. Soren ran towards the watchtower. He was afraid that some lizard men lurkers had already sneaked in. Bang! Suddenly, a muffled sound came from behind him. Then, a woman shouted, "Not good. The warehouse is on fire." Her voice spread throughout the entire village. The patrolling guards and the militia near the watchtower were stunned. Immediately, someone ran over to put out the fire. Shit. Soren didn't think that the lizard men would know to set the fire first. He almost didn't think about it and shouted, "Enemy attack! There are lizard men outside." In the blink of an eye. Suddenly, the sound of a bowstring vibrating could be heard in the night. Then, the guard on the watchtower trembled and fell to the ground. An arrow shot out from the darkness and directly pierced through his leather armor. It went through his chest and into his heart, killing him on the spot. Longbowman. Soren immediately hid in the shadows. The lizard men had trained longbowmen. The leather armor of the militia was like paper in front of a longbow. The ordinary militia was obviously a little panicked. However, the retired adventurers quickly reacted and began to gather others to defend. They had a lot of combat experience. Although they had said goodbye to their adventuring careers, they were not at a loss. Bang! 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 A muffled sound came from outside the door. Then, a young man shouted in horror, "Ogre! Ogre!" Soren's mood suddenly sank to the bottom. He held his curved sword tightly and took a deep breath. Then, he sneaked behind him. The village might not be able to hold on. If necessary, he had to think of a way to break out. The most important thing now was not to deal with the lizard men and ogres outside, but to kill the lurkers that had sneaked in. These enemies that could hide in the shadows were the most dangerous things. If they were allowed to sneak up on him, he wouldn't even need to wait for the outside to break out. The inside would be completely chaotic. I didn't expect to meet my peers so soon. Soren's expression was serious. He quietly moved along the corner of the wall. His figure was blurry in the shadows. He held his curved sword tightly and moved forward slowly. At the same time, he was paying attention to the ground around him. The lurkers couldn't be seen clearly with the naked eye. When they were in stealth mode, they had the effect of invisibility. One could only determine their position through some special signs, such as the footprints on the ground and the slight movements they made when they moved. Soren had fought with his peers more than once or twice. As long as they left a trace, he would be able to find out where they were. The whole village was in a panic. There were screams of women and children, and there were also shouts of adult men. The long-term training of the militia finally had some effect. Many adult men picked up their weapons and gathered together. The fire in the warehouse was getting bigger and bigger. Suddenly, the light in front of the burning fire was distorted. It was as if a hazy figure had appeared and disappeared. Soren instantly rushed out like a cheetah. The curved sword in his hand directly slashed at the empty air in front of him. Blood splattered everywhere. Some kind of creature that looked like a hybrid of a lizard and a human showed its trace. Chapter 63. Die. Soren retracted his sword and thrust forward. Relying on the explosive power of his body, he directly pounced on the lizard man lurker's body. A fishy smell assaulted his nostrils, but Soren's expression did not change as he thrust his sword into the lizard man lurker's body, nailing it to the ground. The lizard man lurker's body lost its balance in an instant, rendering it powerless to resist. The moment it fell to the ground, Soren struck the lizard man lurker's heart. It was only when the lizard man lurker's body stopped twitching that Soren slowly got up. The battle here had attracted a lot of attention. Soren pulled out his curved sword and shouted, "What are you waiting for? Go and defend the front. There should be another lizard man lurker." There were quite a few creatures that could become rogues, but becoming a lurker required a lot of talent. There shouldn't be too many lizard men who had such talent. However, as soon as he heard the commotion, there was a huge fire. There were probably about 2 enemies that had snuck in. They needed someone to help them to set the warehouse on fire. The fire spread quickly, and there were at least 2 or 3 places where the fire was set. Soren once again hid in the shadows. Lizard men had a natural bonus to strength and dexterity. Although their intelligence was not high, their average stats were higher than humans. If the average strength and dexterity of a human was 10, then the average strength and dexterity of a lizard man was 12. The lurkers of the lizard men were quite talented. He had just caught the enemy off guard, and now the enemy should be prepared. It would not be so easy to launch a surprise attack again. What would a lurker do in a situation like this? Soren looked at the fire around him and did not find any signs of lurkers. He thought for a moment and then approached the door. A lurker's assassination ability was very strong. The purpose of setting the fire to disturb the enemy had been achieved. The crying women and children had obviously interfered with the militia's battle. Assassinating the weak women and children was meaningless. In this case, the most likely target of a lurker was the leader of the village, who was the commander of the militia. As long as the commander was lost, the enemy would fight on their own. There was even a possibility that they would directly collapse and assassinate the commander of the militia. The village would be completely finished. Some lizard men had already climbed over the fence. They were so agile that the wooden fence could not stop them. After landing on the ground, the lizard men began to attack the militia guards. Some of them directly rushed to the rear and slaughtered the old, weak, women, and children. This made many of the militia guards so angry that their eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Some even wanted to rush to the rear to protect their wives and children. Bastard! Soren kicked down a militia that was charging at him and roared, "Do you want everyone to die here? Hurry up and fight at the front. Leave these monsters to me." He quickly took out his crossbow and fired. The arrow hit the lizardman warrior's back, and then he jumped forward and chopped off the lizardman's head. The hideous head fell to the ground, and the woman holding the child in her arms screamed in fear. "Shut up." With a slap in the face, Soren slapped the woman directly, and her cheeks swelled up on the spot. He kicked a long sword in front of the woman, picked her up from the ground, and roared, "Don't cry. If you don't want your son to be disemboweled and eaten by the lizard men, pick up your weapon and fight now. Do you know how to cut people?" The woman was stunned by Soren's slap. She looked at Soren's ferocious expression and was so scared that her legs almost gave out. But when she heard Soren's vicious words, her expression quickly changed. She looked down at the crying child. Her hands trembled as she gripped the long sword tightly. Her expression was twisted, and she directly cut the lizardman's corpse. Blood splattered everywhere, and she gritted her teeth and said, "Yes. Go and gather the others." Soren quickly reloaded the crossbow, then looked at the trembling woman in front of him and roared, "Get them to find weapons. Use your swords to cut, use your hands to grab, and use your teeth to bite. There's a group of hungry ogres outside, and they like to eat the tender children first. If you don't want to watch them eat your children, go and fight now." The vicious words caused the woman's expression to become even more twisted. Her maternal instincts were awakened by the cruel words, and her expression became resolute. She was like a warrior who had already decided to die. She gripped the long sword in her hand tightly. Her long years of working in the fields had given her strength that was not weaker than a man's. The woman pulled her child up and shouted to the people nearby. At the same time, she asked the others to gather around her. Very good. Sometimes, vicious words were more effective than heroic encouragement. Soren's expression also became ferocious. The lizard men warriors that rushed in were slashing and killing, and in just a short while, more than 10 people had fallen to the ground. Most of them were old, weak women and children who had no ability to resist. He suddenly jumped onto the roof, determined the position of a lizard man warrior, and then jumped down from the sky. Die! With an angry roar, Soren held the sword with both hands and slashed diagonally at the lizardman's neck. Due to the inertia of the fall, the lizardman's head and half of its shoulder were cut off. He breathed heavily as he kicked the weapon in front of a woman he met during the day. His eyes were slightly bloodshot, and he said in a deep voice, "If you don't want to die, then pick up your weapons and fight." Soren didn't have time to lecture them one by one. He had already used all his strength to shout at the beginning. Everyone nearby could hear him. If this still didn't awaken their desire to fight, then they could only wait for the merciless slaughter. The woman with freckles on her face trembled as she picked up her sword. She opened her mouth to say something, but Soren's figure had already left. He rushed towards another lizard man that rushed in. The young woman took a deep breath, then gripped her weapon tightly and rushed towards the others who had gathered. There were no men or women in this battle. There were only the living and the dead. Soren didn't care about saving ammunition. He loaded his poison crossbow and shot 5 or 6 lizard men in succession. The wyvern's venom paralyzed their bodies. They were killed by the women who had no chance of defeating them. The crazy women tore the lizard men into pieces. The enemies they killed awakened their courage and made them realize that they could also fight. There were still lizard men warriors that were left behind. However, Soren didn't have the energy to care about them. He ran forward, looking for traces of the lurkers. These invisible enemies were like daggers on his back. Soren couldn't fight in peace if he didn't kill them. Everyone in the village was mobilized. The people who lived in the wilderness often encountered monsters. Although they lacked training, they were not completely defenseless. As long as they had the courage to fight, they would be able to kill these lizard men even if they had to sacrifice their lives. Over there. Soren's body that was rushing forward paused, and he threw out the curved sword in his hand. Behind the militia captain, the air suddenly distorted. A lizard man lurker appeared and stabbed at his back with a pitch-black dagger. The blade could pierce through the heart from the back, killing the target in an instant. However, the lizardman's body suddenly stiffened, and its attack was diverted. It only managed to scratch the militia captain's back. The militia captain's battle instincts made him quickly turn around and cut off the lizardman's head with his longsword. Soren jumped up and pulled out his scimitar. He didn't even wait for the militia captain to thank him before he shouted, "The village gate can't hold. Archers! Archers, aim at the ogres." The ogres were born with 18 points of strength. They could use weapons that weighed more than 100 pounds. Almost no one in the village could take their attacks head-on. If the ogres were to rush in, the militia's defensive formation would collapse in an instant. Ogres rarely wore heavy armor. The best way to kill them was to use the archers. Bang! The gate of the village was smashed open in the next moment. 3 ferocious-looking ogres, each standing 3 meters tall and weighing over 500 pounds, rushed in. They held spiked maces that were as thick as an adult's thigh in their hands. The moment they rushed in, they smashed out. One of the militiamen used his shield to block the attack. The powerful force shattered the wooden shield and sent him flying 3 to 4 meters away. He fell to the ground and twitched a little. Soon, he stopped breathing. His chest was completely caved in. Supernatural power. Soren's expression was ugly as he held something in his hand. Chapter 64. Swoosh. 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 The militia reacted quickly and fired a volley of arrows at the ogres. There were many hunters in the villages near the wilderness, and hunting was their main source of meat. But the problem was that hunters mostly used short bows and hard bows, and their damage was far less than longbowmen. Even if they were shooting at close range, the arrows still couldn't deal any fatal damage to the ogres. On the contrary, they even provoked the ogres to go berserk. The ogres used their thick arms to shield their heads. 2 arrows hit their arms, and a few more hit their bodies. They wore simple leather armor and had a thick layer of fat on their bodies. It wouldn't be a problem even if they were hit 10 more times. On the contrary, their skin turned slightly red after they went berserk, and their attacks became even fiercer. A Tier 2 ogre warrior would automatically learn a spell-like ability, and that was the bloodlust that many people were familiar with. Or perhaps it should be called the bloodlust rage. Although these ogres weren't Tier 2 yet, they already had the ability to go berserk. Ogres had a monster level of 5, and when a warrior reached Tier 2, they would reach a total level of 15. They could turn into a berserk killing machine. Get out of the way. The militia captain roared and shouted at a middle-aged man beside him, Kalat. Milos. White Raven Formation. Following the militia captain's roar, 2 militia members who were obviously stronger rushed over. At the same time, with their roars, their muscles expanded as if they were inflated. Their temples bulged slightly, and the veins and blood vessels on their arms could be seen. Whether it was the strength or speed of their attacks, both increased by a lot. It was almost as fast as Soren's heavy slash. Aura-raising slash. This was the ability of a Tier 2 warrior. It could stimulate one's potential and maximize one's strength for a short period of time. Although it could only last for 1 or 2 minutes, the damage it could deal was several times more than usual. This ability was usually used by Tier 2 warriors when they were desperate. They could only activate it once a day, and the duration was determined by their physique. However, it wouldn't last more than 2 minutes. White Raven Formation. Soren was surprised for a moment, but he quickly grabbed his scimitar and wandered around. He was very familiar with the famous White Raven tactic. The White Raven sword art was a high-level combat skill. If 2 people were to use it together, they would be able to form a web of attacks. If 3 or more people were to use it together, they would be able to form a small team formation. Such combat skills were rarely seen among ordinary adventurers. The 3 people in front of him seemed to have participated in wars. Only the army would train in the White Raven Formation. The White Raven sword style consumed a lot of stamina. The 3 middle-aged militiamen formed an inverted triangle as they moved forward. The long swords in their hands glinted coldly as they coordinated their attacks. In just 30 seconds, they had killed 5 to 6 lizardmen. This sudden burst of lethality greatly boosted the courage of the others, and at the same time, it also attracted the attention of the lizardmen. Just as they were about to concentrate on killing the ogres, the sound of a bowstring vibrating could be heard. Longbowman. A cold glint flashed in Soren's eyes as he leaped into the air. He kicked off the railing with the tip of his foot and leaped 6 or 7 meters into the air. His 20 points of extraordinary dexterity exploded at this moment. In a flash, he took out his crossbow and fired blindly at the longbowman. The short time he was in midair didn't allow him to lock onto the target's position. He could only rely on his vision and intuition to make a counterattack. 2 screams could be heard. One of them was a middle-aged man who was in the White Raven Formation. One of them was shot in the abdomen, and his reflexes were slowed by half a beat. His head was smashed by an ogre, and white brain matter splattered everywhere. The scene was so shocking that it made the surroundings quiet down. Then, a young man's heart-wrenching scream could be heard. The dead middle-aged man was his father. The other scream came from outside. Soren had successfully shot the lizardmen longbowman. Although he didn't know if it was a vital point, the poison on the arrow was enough to make it lose its ability to fight. The longbow required a lot of strength from the human body. Although its lethality was top-notch, its power would plummet after being injured. At most, the enemy could only rely on their will to shoot once or twice. Longbowmen were a very precious fighting profession, and the lizardmen had never exposed them to the battlefield. Bang! A dull thud could be heard from the ground. The militia captain cooperated with the White Raven Formation to kill an ogre, but as the time to activate Chi/ ran out, his explosive power began to plummet. When he used his longsword to cut open an ogre's abdomen, his reflexes were half a beat too slow, and he was hit in the arm. His arm was instantly twisted, and he didn't even need to look to know that the bones were completely broken. Without a priest to cast divine spells, he would be crippled after he recovered, and he would never be able to lift heavy objects again. Thump. 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 The morale that had just recovered quickly fell. Half of the militia had died, and although there were still many adult men and hunters in the village, they didn't have much of an advantage against the lizard men. If there were no accidents, the village would be breached in a short period of time. Then, the lizard men would charge in and start a massacre. The ogres would also eat their fill and pack up the food to bring back. The lizard men must have paid a certain price to make these ogres attack. The young men in the village tried their best to save the militia captain, but everyone's eyes were filled with despair. The scales of victory were tilted towards the enemy. Soren's face was also very ugly. There were many lizard men, and there were also some archers outside. If he tried to break through, he might be trapped outside. The militia had already begun to shrink their formation. Many of them were trembling as they held their weapons and retreated bit by bit. It was already very difficult to defend the village gate, and if they continued to stay here, they would only be surrounded by the lizard men. At that time, as long as they occupied the high ground, the archers would be able to kill them all. Heavy footsteps could be heard. The lizard men temporarily slowed down their attack, and then a dark green lizard that weighed about half a ton appeared. On its back was a shriveled and wrinkled lizard man droll. It was holding a withered cane made of vines, and there was even a young leaf growing out of it. Among all the droll, only the lizard men could easily recruit a swamp lizard as their animal companion. Entangle. The lizard man droll threw out something that looked like a dandelion seed. In an instant, vines grew out of the ground in a 15-meter radius. These vines wrapped around the legs of the others, and in an instant, they were trapped in place. Some of the weaker ones were directly tied up by the vines, and couldn't even move their arms that were holding weapons. However, there were still some people who were lucky enough to avoid it. Or rather, they were prepared in advance. Soren had already jumped out of the way before the droll cast his spell, and at the same time, he swung his curved sword to cut off the vines. Entangle was the droll's most common starting spell, so there was no way he wouldn't be prepared for it. But what they didn't expect was that although Soren had successfully dodged the vines, he had become the main target of the lizard man droll. It raised its hand and threw out a dark green powder, and quickly cast a spell. Plague. Soren's arm instantly became red and swollen, and then the exposed skin on his body bulged with pus within a few seconds. The wound began to fester, and pus dripped down along his wrist. He almost couldn't hold the curved sword anymore. A row of data appeared. You've been affected by plague. Plague test of death activated. Enhanced vitality is in effect. You've successfully passed the test of death. You've received 18 plague damage, and will be affected by plague for the next 15 minutes. The fallen withered of the droll. Soren looked at the pustules on his arm with a ferocious expression. He was about to break out of the encirclement, but he suddenly stopped. Even if he had to leave, he had to kill the lizard man droll in front of him first. If it didn't die, the militia here would quickly collapse, and it would be difficult for him to break out of the encirclement. You think you're the only one who can cast spells? Soren roared and took out a spell scroll, and immediately said, "Pay 2500 slaughter EXP. Profession wizard." A wave of elemental energy appeared, and Soren instantly felt as if there was a magic network in the dark. He tore open the spell scroll, and immediately, a burst of shadow energy burst out. Rogues couldn't use high-grade scrolls without enough skill, but wizards didn't have such restrictions. As long as they used mana to activate the spell model on the scroll, they could directly use spell scrolls that exceeded their own profession level. Shadow Tentacles, 4th Circle. Chapter 65. 3 pitch-black tentacles broke out of the ground. They were about the size of a baby's arm, but they were about 30 feet long. The tentacles were made entirely out of shadow energy and wrapped around the monsters in an instant. The first monster to be wrapped around was the ogre. The moment the tentacles touched it, the ogre froze on the spot like a wooden puppet. The power of a level 3 fireball was equivalent to a howitzer, so a level 4 shadow tentacle wasn't as simple as it looked. The highly condensed shadow energy had a paralyzing effect. Any creature touched by the tentacles would have to undergo a test of endurance, or else they would be paralyzed for a few seconds. Although the ogre's strength was high, their vitality wasn't much higher than a human's. Normally, it was around 15 points, so they only had a 50% chance of passing the test of endurance. The tentacles wrapped around the ogre under Soren's control. The 30 feet long tentacles wrapped around the ogre's neck and slowly tightened. Shadow Tentacles, Spellcasting. Circle 4 summon 3 to 6 energy tentacles within 100 feet. You can use your mind to control them to attack enemies. The energy tentacles can be up to 50 feet long. Any target that comes into contact with them must undergo a test of endurance. Otherwise, they will be paralyzed for a few seconds by the shadow energy. The tentacles have a base strength of 15. Every point of spell power increases the caster's strength by 1, up to a maximum of 25 points of strength. Each point of spell power increases the caster's duration by 6 seconds. Soren's intelligence was 18 points. After his subclass, he had a wizard level 1 spell power of 1 point, and his 18 points of intelligence gave him 4 spell power. In other words, the shadow tentacles had 20 points of strength and could last for 30 seconds. Although 30 seconds wasn't a long time, it was enough to decide the life and death of both sides. Crack. The first ogre that was entangled had its neck snapped. The other 2 energy tentacles wrapped around the swamp lizard and wrapped around its limbs in the blink of an eye. At the same time, they wrapped around the waist of the lizard druid and lifted it up. The swamp monitor lizard let out a furious roar, but even if it had successfully passed the endurance immunity test, it could not break free from the energy tentacle's shackles. At the same time, Lizard Man Droll's neck was strangled by an energy tentacle, directly interrupting his casting process. Die. Soren's expression was ferocious. The pain brought about by the plague had completely ignited his murderous intent. The energy tentacles that he directly controlled began to tighten. The lizard man Droll let out a shrill cry as his spine and neck were snapped. His entire body was twisted into a Z shape. An energy tentacle with 20 points of strength was enough to crush it. If there was a difference of more than 5 points of strength, the damage caused would be greatly increased. Sometimes, it could even cause fatal damage. When an ordinary person with 10 strength fought against a professional boxer with 15 strength, the damage would be completely different. This was also the reason why no one could take the ogre's direct attack head-on. Swoosh. 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 Only half of the 30 seconds had passed. Before the others could react, Soren quickly controlled the energy tentacles to shoot out. One energy tentacle continued to bind the swamp monitor lizard, while the other 2 energy tentacles began to mercilessly slaughter the nearby lizard men. The energy tentacles whipped at the nearby lizard men warriors, sending them flying 5 or 6 meters away. When they fell to the ground, their bones were broken in half. A lizard man archer wanted to take advantage of the distance between them and Soren, but the energy tentacles immediately wrapped around him and dragged him down from the 5 or 6 meter tall fence. With a bang, the lizard man archer smashed into the ground. His entire body was almost turned into a meat patty. 30 feet in length meant that the attack range was 20 meters in diameter. It was comparable to many long-range weapons. What are you waiting for? Soren let out a roar. Counterattack. Now, chase them away. 30 seconds wasn't a long time, but the damage done was shocking. The ogre was killed by Soren, and the lizard man Droll was instantly killed. The nearby enemies were all cleaned up in just 15 seconds. After the death of the lizard man Droll, his animal companion, the swamp monitor lizard, began to flee. Soren attacked again and again. With the 3 energy tentacles as the center, there was not a single lizard man warrior left alive within 20 meters. The 3 energy tentacles crisscrossed and attacked. None of the lizard men present could last more than a second. Wizard. The surviving militia members cried out in fear and surprise. They then began to circle around the energy tentacles to launch a counterattack. On the other hand, the lizard men were terrified. The terrifying and unknown magic had greatly damaged their morale, especially after their leader, the Droll, was killed. Some of the nearby lizard men warriors had already fled out of fear. Spellcasters were the nightmare of all intelligent creatures. They were powerful and mysterious, and their fear of magic had long seeped into their bones. Otherwise, the monsters in the wilderness wouldn't have avoided those who obviously knew how to use magic. The situation was reversed in just 30 seconds. Soren released the shadow tentacles to kill the remaining ogre, and then killed the lizard man Droll, the withered. More than 10 lizard men who had rushed into the village were killed in a short time. The continuous deaths of their own made them feel terrified. The wizard's terrifying power caused many lizard men to scatter. Some of them directly fled into the night. Victory? The surviving militia members murmured in disbelief, "We won." The enemy ran away. The lizard men ran away. A burst of cheers sounded. Even Soren had underestimated the enemy's fear of magic. Even though the energy tentacles dissipated after 30 seconds, the fear in the hearts of the lizard men had already suppressed their desire to fight. The initial casualties had already reached 20%, but Soren's burst of power had directly raised the casualties to 40%. The death of their leader had completely destroyed their courage to continue fighting. More and more lizard men began to flee into the night. Cheers spread throughout the village. However, after the cheers, there were mournful cries. The militia members looked for their loved ones with bloodshot eyes. A soldier with a broken arm endured the pain and called out the names of his wife and children with a choked voice. There were also some seriously injured people lying on the ground and wailing. Some of them couldn't be saved. Their companions held back their grief and sent them into the arms of the Grim Reaper. If they weren't given a quick death, they would even wail for an entire day before dying in endless pain. More and more cries sounded. Everyone's face was filled with sorrow because they had lost many people. Their wives, children, parents, and many familiar friends. The merciless slaughter of the lizard men had caused a lot of casualties. The death toll in the village exceeded 100 people. The fire was still burning. Some places that were completely burned could no longer be extinguished. The survivors were busy treating the wounded and trying to salvage as much as they could from the fire. The cold winter was coming, and this year's winter would be extremely difficult for them. The cries of women and children could be heard everywhere. Although the men who had experienced a difficult battle tried their best to suppress their emotions, when they saw the bodies of their children's parents, they couldn't help but cry. They even let out extremely suppressed howls like a lone wolf. A young man stood in front of the fire. He was holding the body of a young girl in his arms. She looked to be about 16 or 17 years old. She wasn't beautiful, but at most, she could only be described as delicate. Her skin was slightly dark, and her hands were rough. Because of long-term labor, her actual age might be younger than she looked. The young man held the body in his arms and stood there blankly. Although he didn't cry at all, one could feel his sorrow. He stood there like a fool until a house collapsed under the fire. When the others rushed over to pull him over, he seemed to have woken up and let out a desolate wail. Ah! He frantically pulled out his weapon and slashed at the body of the lizard men, causing blood and flesh to splatter everywhere. No one stopped him. Soren didn't know who the dead girl was to him. She could have been his lover, or his family, but he could feel the pain in her heart. Yet, there was nothing he could do. Sometimes, the world was just so cruel. He had already seen too many deaths and parting. Asterisk clang. Asterisk Soren looked at the body of the lizard man drool. For the first time, he didn't rush to loot. He tore a piece of cloth from his clothes and bit it in his mouth. Then, with trembling hands, he slowly cut off the rotten flesh and abscesses on his arm. The power of the plague spell hadn't dissipated yet. If he didn't cut off the rotten flesh and abscesses, it would continue to harm him. A suppressed howl of pain. Soren's whole body was trembling. He cut off the rotten flesh bit by bit, and applied the potion on it with a twisted expression. Chapter 66. The first rays of the morning sun shone down on the village. The entire village had turned into ruins. Although they managed to salvage a lot of things from the fire, many of the houses had been destroyed. From time to time, there were muffled sounds of sobbing. People with faces full of dust were collecting the bodies of the dead. From time to time, relatives and friends could be heard crying. This night brought them too much pain, but it also made them a lot stronger. The surviving militia looked like real warriors. They were still guarding the surroundings, guarding against a possible second attack from the lizard men. As long as they were given some time, they would grow into qualified warriors. Soren sat on the watchtower and smoked. The pipe was given to him by the militia captain. It wasn't some high-end tobacco, just a small bag of cheap shredded tobacco that cost 1 silver dural. He put the shredded tobacco into the pipe, lit it, and took a deep puff. Then he looked into the distance, a little lost in thought. The cruel battle last night reminded him of the turbulent years that were about to come. In the future, such battles would be very common, and there would even be more cruel and merciless killings. His arm was still in pain. The rotten flesh that was cut off was regenerating. The combination of numbness and pain made his expression a little twisted. He trembled slightly as he took a deep puff from the pipe. There were no painkillers in this world. Although he had a digitized template, he couldn't reduce the pain. The nerves that he had trained to be very tough were not that good in front of the pain of cutting flesh. He needed to numb himself a little and temporarily forget about the wound on his arm. Here. The militia captain came over. His eyes were red as if he had cried for someone. Perhaps his family had also died last night. Humans in the wastelands were resilient, just like the men in the north. Living in a harsh environment could temper a person's will. They wouldn't fall so easily, or at least they wouldn't fall so easily. Soren shook his head and refused the liquor that was offered. He took a deep puff from the pipe and slowly said, "I don't drink." He didn't drink. Even if he was seriously injured, he didn't drink. The militia captain's arm was broken. He sat down with some difficulty and took a sip of the liquor with his good hand. Then he said, "Thank you. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have been able to survive last night." Soren didn't say anything. The militia captain reached out and took out a package. There was a clanking sound inside. It seemed to be filled with coins. He handed it over with difficulty and said in a deep voice, "I know you are an adventurer. I'm afraid that the scroll you used last night was your trump card. We've already lost too much, so we can only use this to express our sincerity. This is the White Raven sword style that I obtained years ago. I've been to the battlefield in the south. Even though I only have the first half of it, it should be useful to you. The rest of the money is a token of our appreciation. Although it's not much, I hope you can accept it." Soren's arm trembled as he put down the pipe. His injuries wouldn't heal that quickly, even if he had the gift of regeneration. He picked up the book on the White Raven sword style. It was a handwritten copy of the book. There were some unclear drawings on the book, but he could still roughly understand the moves. Soren pushed back the small bag of coins and took another puff from his pipe. He then slowly said, "I'll take this book, but you can keep the money for yourselves. I'm afraid you'll have a hard time this winter. If you collect some items from the lizard men, you should be able to get by." He turned around and looked at the people behind him. He picked up a withered cane and supported his body. A green leaf was swaying in the wind. He slowly said, "You better leave today. The lizard men won't give up so easily. Something big might have happened in the wilderness. Leave this place and find a place to live. As long as you're alive, there's hope for the future." Soren sighed softly. He waved the pipe in his hand, squeezed out a smile, and said, "This pipe is the reward you gave me. I'm leaving now. You should make a decision soon." He left just like that. Most people didn't even notice him. Only a few people watched Soren's tired figure disappear into the distance. He was a rogue, and rogues were such a group of people. It wasn't strange for him to leave quietly like that. He didn't need flowers or thanks. He just did what he wanted to do and started the next part of his journey. Soren went back along the main road. The route was getting more and more dangerous. The lizard men had just attacked the humans near the Black Swamp before he left, but now they were approaching the outer territory of Whiterun. If the lizard men did not stop fighting for territory, a war would break out soon. Whiterun did not pay much attention to the villages in the wilderness, but if the villages that provided tax revenue to the city were attacked, the city guards and garrison troops would be dispatched to deal with them. His injuries wouldn't heal in a short time. He couldn't do any strenuous activities for at least a day or two. Soren prepared to go back along the main road. He had gained nearly 5,000 slaughter EXP from last night's battle. It was enough for him to level up as a rogue or wizard. He needed time to memorize spells. This was a relatively safe place. He wasn't interested in staying to help those people because they were just strangers. Soren didn't even know their names, and they didn't know Soren's name either. They only knew that he was a rogue who could use spells. The lizard men gave a lot of slaughter EXP. The two lurkers gave nearly 1,200 slaughter EXP, the ordinary fighters gave about 200, and the ogre and droll gave Soren almost 2,000 slaughter EXP. Killing spellcasters gave more soul energy than killing spellcasters, but they were also much harder to deal with. Finally, there was the reward after the battle. You defeated the lizard men that attacked at night. After a difficult battle, your skills have improved by quite a bit. Use of magic devices +10, concentration +5, listen +5, search +3, sneak +3, dodge, roll, +2, dodge, shift, +1, negotiate +2, parry +2, heal +2, spell identification +2. You have some understanding of the ability, spell control. The improvement from this battle was very obvious. Not to mention the improvement of many basic skills, just the last ability prompt had already exceeded Soren's expectations. Ability prompt. This was the sign of mastering and training a certain ability. Under some special circumstances, you may directly get the information of a certain ability. Then, after a period of training, you can slowly master this ability. Although spell control was only the most basic casting ability, for Soren, it meant that he could save a necessary ability point. This was a great help for him to level up as a wizard, because there was no ability reward for his part-time job as a wizard. Only when he reached level 3 as a wizard would he be able to get his first ability point. Soren's strength didn't increase by much as a part-time wizard. He only got 4 rank 0 spell slots and 1 rank 1 spell slot. From now on, he would get an increase in the number of spell slots for every wizard level, and at the same time, he would get an extra rank 0 spell slot. High-grade wizards and warlocks had a lot of rank 0 spell slots, sometimes so many that they couldn't even use them all. However, rank 0 spells were very weak because they were called cantrips, which were considered unorthodox spells. Unless you were a talented caster like Vivian, you would rarely use rank 0 spells in a battle. There were no rank 0 spells in the spellbook. This was because wizards rarely copied down cantrips. Their spell models were relatively simple, and some of them didn't even require casting time. For example, the most commonly used, Magician's Hand. That was why Soren hadn't mastered any rank 0 spells yet. He needed to go to the city's spellbook shop to buy rank 0 spell copying scrolls. These scrolls were very cheap, only 1/3 of the price of a rank 1 spell. Most of them were things that only wizard apprentices would need. Soren was lucky enough to not encounter any enemies after a day of traveling. His talent of regeneration was very powerful, and he could already move his arms. However, it was still a little inconvenient for him to fight. He found an inn in the nearest town to rest. Since the roads to Whiterun were blocked, this small town that relied on trade to make a living was a little depressed. He could hear the complaints of the residents. They were all complaining about the high taxes they collected every year, and they couldn't even solve this little problem. They didn't know how long it would take. Soren entered the room that was arranged for him and told the innkeeper not to disturb him. He needed to level up as a wizard and start memorizing his first spell model. This would take a long time, and he couldn't be disturbed. If he didn't tell the innkeeper in advance, who knew if the innkeeper would come knocking on his door? After all, Soren was a half-elf with 16 points of charm. Judging from his appearance, he could be considered a handsome human if it wasn't for his cold expression. Chapter 67. In a quiet guest room. Soren slowly closed his eyes and began to sense the magic network, which was also known as the weave by spellcasters. The weave was a formless energy field that existed in many parts of the universe. Its greatest use was to help spellcasters construct spell models, and then condense the energy of nature to form spell slots and store them. Once the spell slots were stored, all one needed to do was to activate them with words and actions, and they would be able to quickly draw energy from the surroundings to cast spells. The energy of nature itself was very violent and not easy to control. Without the weave, it would be much more difficult to cast spells. Another use of the weave was to limit the abilities of spellcasters, and prevent powerful spellcasters that even the gods feared from destroying the balance of order. It was a tool that helped spellcasters with insufficient talent to cast spells more easily, and it also prevented spellcasters with extraordinary talent from threatening the domain of the gods. All in all, the weave was a very important thing. Without it, the number of spellcasters in the world would decrease by 90%. The faith network of the gods was also connected to the weave, but it was located at the highest level of the weave. Divine spells were fed back from the power of faith. The weave helped spellcasters control energy, and normal spellcasters could access the surface of the weave. Meditation. This was the simplest way for a magus to sense the weave. It was no different from sitting in meditation, and there was no need for any particular posture. The key was to let go of one's body and mind, gradually forgetting about one's senses, and then extend one's consciousness to the energy in the outside world. Soren had directly skipped the initial accumulation period of meditation, which meant that he did not need to meditate for a long period of time like an acolyte before being able to access the surface of the weave. As his senses gradually expanded, Soren faintly touched a layer of formless energy field. It looked like a spider web formed by countless invisible lines, and the squares in between were the spell slots used by magi. These were the spell slots on the surface, and could be used to cast rank 0 spells. The weave was only a channel to help with casting spells. The real power was in the mind of a magus, which was the spell model constructed in the mind. After successfully connecting to the weave, Soren stopped meditating. Meditation was not the main method for magi to increase their strength. Their true strength lay in the development of their brains. The greatest use of meditation was to help them understand the weave and then extend it to the most external energy. Upgrade wizard profession rank. Soren wasn't in a hurry to analyze the spell model. Instead, he began to level up his profession. A higher wizard's level would allow him to interact with the magic net, which would speed up his analysis of spell models. Wizards needed 50% more slaughter EXP to level up compared to other professions, and there was a 20% EXP penalty if it was a subclass. Leveling up to level 2 rogue only required 200 slaughter EXP, but leveling up to level 2 wizard required 300 EXP. Wizard profession raised to level 2. Received 22, INT 18 plus, INT 18 to 10, asterisk 0, 5, skill points, HP increased by 9, profession HP 4 plus, con 20 to 10, asterisk 0, 5. Obtained 1 free attribute point. The biggest advantage of subclasses was that they could receive additional free attribute points. The disadvantage was that it was very difficult to raise a profession to a higher level. In the beginning, many people liked to subclass 4 professions at the same time, but the result was that unless they succeeded in slaying a god, their profession's levels would not be high. This was because the first subclass had a 20% slaughter EXP penalty, and the second had a 40% slaughter EXP penalty. At the same time, the subclass required 5,000 slaughter EXP. The third subclass was even more ridiculous. Not only did it have a 60% slaughter EXP penalty, but it also required 10,000 slaughter EXP. This subclass penalty was applied to all professions levels. In other words, Soren would have to pay an additional 20% slaughter EXP to level up his rogue profession. Under normal circumstances, there were very few people who could subclass that many professions. This was because subclasses had attribute requirements and required a lot of time. Even the talented NPCs in the storyline, or the sons of God with extremely high attributes, could only subclass around 2 professions. Only a few gods could subclass multiple professions at the same time. Subclasses required more time and energy, and converting them into slaughter EXP required more soul energy. Before reaching level 5, the amount of slaughter EXP required to level up was not much. However, from level 2 onwards, the amount of slaughter EXP required to level up would increase exponentially. At level 3, the amount of slaughter EXP required would be astonishing. The higher the level of subclasses, the harder it would be to level up. At that time, there would not be enough enemies in the mortal world. It would be impossible to level up without exploring the underworld and the outer planes. For example, if one wanted to reach the realm of legends, they would have to go to the abyss. Assign free attribute points to intelligence. Although Soren wanted to increase his dexterity, considering the impending collapse of the weave, he decided to increase his intelligence to 20 points first. This way, he would not lose his spellcasting ability in the future. The skill points gained from leveling up as a wizard were allocated to knowledge. One of the most important factors for a wizard's mastery of spells was the amount of knowledge and skill points he had. Wizard profession leveled up to level 3. Received 24, INT 19 plus, INT 19 to 10, asterisk 0, 5, skill points, HP increased by 9, profession HP 4 plus, con 20 to 10, asterisk 0, 5. Received an ability point. Level 3 wizards could receive an additional ability point, but it could only be chosen from the wizard profession. Soren was not very familiar with the wizard profession's leveling up, so he first looked at the spellcasting abilities that wizards could master. Battle spellcasting, proficiency. Wizards gradually increase their abilities through long-term training. Even if they are attacked in battle, their spellcasting will not be easily interrupted. With the increase of this ability, even if a wizard is directly attacked, they can still successfully cast spells. Once this ability reached a certain level, some sorcerers would be able to cast spells while they were fighting. However, this may require the combination of silent spell release and instant spell release. Focus plus 10. Mobile spellcasting, mastery. Wizards can cast spells while moving under special training. They won't interrupt their own spellcasting process while moving and dodging. At the same time, as the level of this ability increases, wizards can cast spells while flying and moving at high speed. This is one of the abilities that high-grade wizards must master. Otherwise, when flying, it will cause the spellcasting to fail. Focus plus 5. Spell control, proficiency. Wizards can use their spirit to control the spells they cast, strengthen the energy of the spells, or weaken the effects of the spells. Some summoning spells require the ability to control in order to have a strong effect. This ability is the prerequisite for Empower Spell and Maximize Spell. Only after mastering spell control can the power of the spells be further increased. Encyclopedic memory, talent. Wizards often have amazing memory abilities. This ability can further increase their memory ability, and at the same time, strengthen their understanding of various knowledge, gradually reaching the realm of understanding by analogy. This ability can strengthen the training effect of other abilities. If they master eidetic memory, at the same time, they can further increase the speed of mastery. Knowledge plus 10. Maybe it was because of the personal ability, eidetic memory, this time there was an additional ability, encyclopedic memory, to choose from. Soren looked at the abilities that could be obtained and couldn't help but fall into deep thought. First of all, spell control was an ability that could be given up because he had already received the information about it. If nothing unexpected happened, he should be able to master it very quickly. Then there was the ability, spellcasting in battle. This ability was very powerful because wizards couldn't always cast spells from a distance. If they were attacked while casting spells, the chances of the spell being interrupted were very high. However, with this ability, the spell wouldn't be interrupted, and it could also passively increase the focus of one's basic skills by 10 points. Then there was the ability, mobile spellcasting. As the name suggested, it strengthened the ability to cast spells while moving. When casting a spell, it could be interrupted by an attack, and it could also fail while moving. This was especially true in the future when wizards learned high-speed movement spells, as well as higher-grade flying spells. Without this ability, the chances of failure were as high as 50%. Both of these were very important abilities. However, Soren's heart was obviously a little hesitant because he was more inclined towards encyclopedic memory. First of all, it could increase knowledge. Second, it could further strengthen memory and comprehension. The additional 10 points of knowledge were also very helpful in mastering spells. More importantly, it was a natural ability. This ability couldn't be learned through training, and Soren also knew that with this ability, as his knowledge increased, he could learn an additional ability. Encyclopedic ability, your knowledge has become more and more astonishing. You have an understanding of almost every field. As you accumulate more knowledge, you can comprehend most things by analogy. Your learning speed is several times faster than others. This is not only limited to knowledge, but also a variety of combat skills. You know how to calculate the axis of a weapon's weight and use it to maximize its power. However, you don't only know these. With the accumulation of knowledge to your current level, you can directly transform it into real power. Knowledge plus 10, prerequisite, have, encyclopedic memory, ability, 250 knowledge. Focus, basic skills, your focus ability can be used in many ways. For example, the success rate of casting spells, the speed of entering the state of meditation, the effect of meditation, the success rate of copying scrolls, the success rate of making magic staffs and rare items, etc. More often than not, a focused person will gain more insight when they focus on something, even if it's learning combat skills. P.S. Focus also has a bonus effect on the warrior's training. Chapter 68. In the end, Soren decided to take the encyclopedic knowledge ability. The other 3 abilities could be learned through training, but the innate ability was very difficult to obtain through conventional means. Encyclopedic knowledge was a very useful ability. If it wasn't for the eidetic memory ability, many people would have taken it from the very beginning. When Soren chose the new ability, the slaughter EXP cost had reached nearly 3,000 points. Wizards already needed a lot of EXP to level up, and now there was an additional penalty for taking a subclass. The slaughter EXP that was enough to raise a rogue to level 5 was only enough to raise a wizard to level 4. Wizard has leveled up to level 4. Receive 24, INT 19 plus, INT 19 to 10, asterisk 0, 5, skill points, HP increased by 9, profession HP 4 plus, con 20 to 10, asterisk 0, 5. Received 1 free attribute point. Without a doubt. Soren continued to increase his intelligence, which had just reached 20 points. Even if the weave collapsed in the future, he wouldn't completely lose his spellcasting ability. Now that he had an extra subclass, he had an additional 20% EXP penalty when leveling up as a rogue. The slaughter EXP required to level up to level 7 had increased from 4,500 to 5,400. The more subclasses he took, the slower his speed of leveling up. Even though there's an additional 20% EXP penalty, I also received 2 extra attribute points. Soren looked at his stats and murmured, overall, it's not a loss. At least after mastering spells, the increase in combat strength is very obvious. The 20% EXP penalty was already very serious, especially after leveling up later on. So Soren basically gave up on the idea of taking another class. If possible, he would try to level up to one of the classes. The most obvious benefit of taking a subclass in the early stages was the extra attribute points. He could use Slaughter EXP to exchange for more attribute points. If he took 4 classes at the same time, he could even get an extra 6 free attribute points. However, the downside was that leveling up was very slow. The 60% EXP penalty was torturous, and it wouldn't be so easy to become a high-grade class in the future. The skill points were mainly allocated to literacy. Soren raised it to 90 points, and then allocated 5 points to spell identification. There wasn't much Slaughter EXP left. After Soren distributed all the abilities, the current data page had become, name, Soren. Race, half-elf attributes, strength 14, plus 2, dexterity 20, plus 1, constitution 20, intelligence 20, plus 1, wisdom 15, charm 16. Alignment, lawful evil profession, level 10 commoner / level 6 rogue, 05400, Level 4 Wizard, 1252750, Grade 2, HP, 9090 Experience, 1875, Slaughter EXP, 150, Profession EXP, unassigned. Skill points, 0 attribute points, none status, normal basic skills, Sneak 113, Literacy 90, Steal 35, Pick Lock 45, Snare 55, Focus 8, Negotiate 5, Appraise 3, Deception 3, Intimidation 10, Taunt 5, Performance 1, Listen 9, Evasion 15, Parry 5, Block 1, Heal 11, Search 8, Spellcraft 10, Survival 2, Use Magic Device 10. Legendary skill, Omnipotent Hands, Sealed, Weakened State, Personal Abilities, Nimble Left Hand, Eidetic Memory, Perseverance, Encyclopedic Knowledge, Regeneration, Beginner, Profession Abilities, Grasp of Shadows, Military Weapon, Proficiency, Curved Sword, Master, Combat Skills, Shadow Strike, Sword Form, Heavy Hack. I already have 8 abilities. Soren carefully looked at his data page and murmured, I have 2 more abilities than when I was at the same level. If I can become a legendary, I should be much stronger than before. He gently opened the spellbook and tried to use his power of the will to analyze the structure of the first spell. Arcane Missile. It was the most commonly used level 1 spell by spellcasters. Its advantage was that its power was not bad and its casting time was very short. It only had 1 second of casting time. Arcane Missile, level 1 spell. The spellcaster condenses arcane energy into a ball at the fingertip and shoots it at a specific target. It has a base spell power of 5. Every 2 profession levels can add an additional arcane missile. A profession level 9 spellcaster can shoot up to 5 arcane missiles at the same time. Although it was only a level 1 spell, there were more than 10 pages of spell models and incantations recorded in it. Soren roughly flipped through it and memorized the basic words and patterns in his mind. Then he began to meditate and connect to the magic net. At the same time, he tried to construct the spell model according to the knowledge in the spellbook. Midnight quickly passed by. When Soren opened his eyes and closed the spellbook, his face was slightly pale and he looked unusually tired. Even though it was only a first circle spell, it was still very difficult for him to construct the spell model. The main problem was that Arcane Missile actually had more than 300 spell nodes and about 50 spell circuits. If it wasn't for his excellent memory, it would have taken him a few days to memorize the basic structure. This is like a magical version of the energy gun. Soren frowned and rubbed his head. He flipped open the spellbook again and felt dizzy after just one glance. He knew that his mind was reaching its limit. The spell nodes of Arcane Missile consisted of 3 parts: extracting energy, compressing energy, and guiding the spell circuits. If it was explained using the energy guns of the Galactic Era as the standard, then the energy bullets were formed by the wizard's mana, while the gun itself was formed by the wizard's mind. The target was guided by the spell circuits. It was a bit like an infrared ray aiming device. I've only completed less than a fifth of it. Soren roughly flipped through the spellbook and closed his eyes. If I want to master this level 1 spell, I'll need at least 5 more days. Even with my 20 points of intelligence, eidetic memory, and 90 points of knowledge, it still took me such a long time. Wouldn't other wizards need 1 or 2 months to master this level 1 spell? Actually, Soren was wrong. A normal wizard would need 3 months to master a level 1 spell. After graduating as an apprentice, it would take about 3 months to master the first level 1 spell. There were very few wizards, and even fewer of them would choose to venture out into the outside world. A large number of wizards would be stuck at the door of grade 3 for their entire lives. They would never be able to cross the threshold and become a high-grade spellcaster. The night was getting darker. Soren was resting on his bed. Maybe it was because his mind was overdrawn, but he couldn't fall asleep no matter how hard he tried. It was like trying to memorize a super long academic paper. Although he tried his best to memorize a lot of it, he still felt dizzy and sleepy when he laid on his bed. Overuse of the brain. This was Soren's first reaction. He tried to meditate to alleviate this situation, but the effect was not obvious. On the contrary, he couldn't meditate because of his exhaustion. In the end, he could only close his eyes and wait. After a long time, he finally fell asleep. The next day. By the time Soren woke up, it was already noon. For the first time, his biological clock didn't wake him up. It wasn't until the owner of the inn knocked on his door that Soren got up in a daze. He had overslept today. Fortunately, his mind had recovered well, and he didn't feel as dizzy as he did yesterday. The speed of a spellcaster's improvement couldn't be compared to that of a melee wizard. Although Soren had used Slaughter EXP to become a level 4 wizard, he still hadn't mastered a single spell yet. He hurriedly ate something in the inn, then rushed back to Whiterun. The lizard men in the Black Swamp had already spread to the outskirts of the wilderness, and the road would be blocked for the time being. He might need to stay in Whiterun for a while. Fortunately, although there were many wars and massacres before the time of troubles, Whiterun still existed until he reached the realm of legends. In other words, even if Whiterun was involved in a war, it wouldn't be destroyed like Amber City. It shouldn't be a problem for him to stay here for a while. It had been a few days since Soren left Whiterun. He planned to go back and see how Vivian was doing, and then copy some level 0 spell scrolls. Although he had decided to let Vivian learn from the mistress of the caravan, he was still a little worried. There were very few people in this world that he could trust. It wasn't until noon on the third day that Soren finally returned to Whiterun. Due to the recent incidents, the city didn't focus on the investigation of the fire. Now, the entire city was talking about something else. Amber City had been reduced to rubble. In this era, information spread very slowly. It had been a long time since the news of Amber City's destruction had spread. Although Soren had already guessed it, when he heard the news, he was still speechless for a long time. A city had been destroyed, just like that. The number of casualties couldn't be calculated, but it was likely to be more than 10,000 people. This news shocked many places, and many churches even sent out high-grade professions to investigate. Some of them even had legendary realm professions. Some churches sought answers from the righteous gods, but surprisingly, they didn't receive any response or oracle. Although priests could still receive divine spells, it seemed that all the gods had suddenly disappeared. They no longer responded to the prayers of their believers, and some rituals couldn't even summon their will. It was as if the prayers of the gods had sunk into the ocean, and there were no waves. This news was tightly sealed, but many people still sensed it. Something big seemed to have happened in the kingdom of the gods. All the gods had recently fallen into silence. Priests could still receive divine spells through prayers, but they could no longer contact the gods that they believed in. You're tuning into the Dreamy Love Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.